Section 25 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 3, Fetes Given in Lucretia's Honor. The wedding festivities in Ferrara continued for 6 days during the Carnival. At the period of the Renaissance, court functions and festivities, so far as the intellectual part is concerned, were not unlike those of the present day. But the magnificent costumes, the highly developed sense of material beauty, and the more elaborate etiquette of the age which gave birth to Castiglione's Cortegiano lent these festivities a higher character. The 16th century was far behind our own in many of its productions, theatrical performances, displays of fireworks, and concert music. There were illuminations and mounted torchlight processions, and rockets were frequently used. But an illuminated garden fete, such as the Emperor of Austria gave for the Shah of Persia at Schönbrunn, would at that time have been impossible. The same might be said of certain forms of musical entertainment, for example, concerts. Society in that age would have shuddered at the orchestral music of today, and the ear-splitting drums would have appeared barbarous to the Italians of the Renaissance, just as would the military parades, which are still among the favorite spectacles with which distinguished guests are either honored or intimidated at the great courts of Europe. Even then, tournees were rare, although there were occasional combats of gladiators, whose costumes were greatly admired. The Duke and his master of ceremonies had spent weeks in preparing the program for the wedding festivities, although these did not admit of any great variety, being limited as they are now to banquets, balls, and theatrical productions. It was from the last-named form of entertainment that Ercole promised himself the most, and which, he expected, would win for him the applause of the cultivated world. He was one of the most active patrons of the theatre during the Renaissance. Several years before, he had commissioned the poets at his court to translate some of the plays of Plautus and Terence into terza rima, and had produced them. Guarino, Berardo, Colanuccio, and even Boiardo had been employed in this work by him. As early as 1486, an Italian version of the Menechmi, the favorite play of Plautus, had been produced in Ferrara. In February 1491, when Ercole, with most brilliant festivities, celebrated the betrothal of his son Alfonso and Anna Sforza, the Menechmi and one of the comedies of Terence were given. The Amphitryon, which Cagnolo had prepared for the stage, was also played. There was no permanent theatre in Ferrara, but a temporary one had been erected which served for the production of plays which were given only during the Carnival and on other important occasions. Ercole had arranged a salon in the Palace of the Podestà, a Gothic building opposite the church, which is still standing and is known as the Palazzo della Regione. The salon was connected with the palace itself by a passageway. A raised stage called the tribune was erected. It was about 120 feet long and 150 feet wide. It had houses of painted wood, and whatever was necessary in the way of scenery, rocks, trees, etc. It was separated from the audience by a wooden partition in which was a sheet metal curtain. On the forward part of the stage, the orchestra, sat the princes and other important personages, and in the amphitheatre were 13 rows of cushioned seats, those in the middle being occupied by the women, and those at the sides by the men. This space accommodated about 3,000 people. According to Strozzi, Ariosto, Calcagnini, and other humanists of Ferrara, it was Ercole himself who constructed this theatre. They and other academicians probably took part in the performances, but the Duke also brought actors from abroad, from Mantua, Siena, and Rome. They numbered in all no less than 110 persons, and it was necessary to build a new dressing room for them. The theatrical performances on this brilliant occasion must therefore have aroused great expectations. The festivities began February 3rd, and it was soon apparent that the chief attraction would be the beauty of 3 famous women, Lucretia, Isabella, and the Duchess of Urbino. They were regarded as the 3 handsomest women of the age, and it was difficult to decide which was the fairer, Isabella or Lucretia. The Duchess of Mantua was 6 years older than her sister-in-law, but a most beautiful woman, and with a feminine curiosity she studied Lucretia's appearance. In the letters which she daily wrote to her husband in Mantua, she carefully described the dress of her rival, but said not a word regarding her personal charms. Concerning Donna Lucretia's figure, so she wrote February 1st, I shall say nothing, for I am aware that your Majesty knows her by sight. She was unable to conceal her vanity, and in another letter, written February 3rd, she gave her husband to understand that she hoped, so far as her own personality and her retinue were concerned, to be able to stand comparison with any of the others, and even to bear away the prize. One of the ladies of her suite, the Marquesana of Cotrone, wrote the Duke, saying, quote, "The bride is not especially handsome, but she has an animated face, and in spite of her having such a large number of ladies with her, and notwithstanding the presence of the illustrious Lady of Urbino, who is very beautiful, and who clearly shows that she is your Excellency's sister, my illustrious Mistress Isabella, according to our opinion, and of those who came with the Duchess of Ferrara, is the most beautiful of all. There is no doubt about this. Compared with Her Majesty, all the others are as nothing. Therefore we shall bring the prize home to the house of our mistress." The first evening of the festivities, a ball was given in the great salon of the palace, at which the attendance was so large that many were unable to gain admission. Lucretia was enthroned upon a tribune, and near her were the princesses of Mantua and Urbino. Other prominent ladies and the ambassadors also came and took up a position near her. The guests, therefore, in spite of the crowd, had a chance to admire the beautiful women and their gowns and jewels. During the Renaissance, balls were less formal than they are now. Pleasures then were more natural and simple. Frequently the ladies danced with each other, and sometimes even alone. The dances were almost exclusively French, for even at that time France had begun to impose her customs on all the rest of the world. Still there were some Spanish and Italian ones. Lucretia was a graceful dancer, and she was always ready to display her skill. She frequently descended from the tribune and executed Spanish and Roman dances to the sound of the tambourine. The following day the eagerly expected dramatic performances were given. First, the Duke had the actors appear in masks and costumes for the purpose of reviewing them. The director of the troupe then came forward in the characters of Plautus and read the program and the argument of each piece, which was to be rendered during the 5 evenings. The selection of comedies by living dramatists in the year 1502 could not have cost the Duke much thought, for there were none of any special importance. The Calandra of Duvizzi, which a few years later caused such a sensation, was not yet written. It is true Ariosto had already composed his Casaria and the Suppositi, but he had not yet won sufficient renown for him to be honored by their presentation at the wedding festivities. Moreover, the Duke would have none but classic productions. He wanted to set all the world talking. And, in truth, Italy had never seen any theatrical performances equal to these. We possess careful descriptions of them, which have not yet been incorporated in the history of the stage. They show more clearly than do the reports regarding the Vatican Theatre in the time of Leo X what was the real nature of theatrical performances during the Renaissance. Consequently, they constitute a valuable picture of the times. If one could follow the reports of Gagnolo, Zambotto, and Isabella, and reproduce in imagination the brilliant wedding and the guests in their rich costumes seated in rows, he would behold one of the fairest and most illustrious gatherings of the Renaissance. This scene, rich in form and color, taken in conjunction with the stage and the performances of the comedies of Plautus, and with the pantomimes and the moresche, which occupied the time between the acts, is so romantic that we might imagine ourselves translated to Shakespeare's Midsummer's Night Dream, and that Duke Ercole had changed places with Theseus, Duke of Athens, and that the comedies were being performed before him and the happy bridal pair. According to the program, from February 3rd to February 8th, with the exception of one evening, 5 of the plays of Plautus were to be given. The intermissions were to be devoted to music and moresche. The moresca resembled the modern ballet, that is, a pantomime dance. It is of very ancient origin, and traces of it appear in the Middle Ages. At first it was a war dance in costume, which character it preserved for a long time. The name is, I believe, derived from the fact that in all the Latin countries which suffered from the invasions of the Saracens, dances in which the participants were armed and which simulated the battles of the Moor and Christian were executed. The Moors, for the sake of contrast, were represented as black. Subsequently, the meaning of the term moresca was extended to include the ballet in general, and all sorts of scenes in which dances accompanied by flutes and violins were introduced. The subjects were derived from mythology, the age of chivalry, and everyday life. There were also comic dances performed by fantastic monsters, peasants, clowns, wild animals, and satyrs, during which blows were freely dealt right and left. The classico-romantic ballet appears to have reached a high development in Ferrara, which was the home of the romantic epics, the Mambriano and the Orlando. It is needless to say that the ballet possessed great attraction for the public in those days, just as it now does. The presentation of the comedies of Plautus would have no more effect upon people of this age than would a puppet show. They lasted from 4 to 5 hours, from 6 in the evening until midnight. The first evening, the Duke conducted his guests into the theatre, and when they had taken their seats, Plautus appeared before the bridal couple and addressed some complimentary verses to them. After this, the Epidicus was presented. Each act was followed by a ballet, and 5 beautiful moresche were given during the interludes of the play. First entered 10 armed gladiators, who danced to the sound of tambourines. Then followed a mimic battle between 12 people in different costumes. The third moresca was led by a young woman upon a car which was drawn by a unicorn, and upon it were several persons bound to the trunk of a tree, while seated under the bushes were 4 lute players. The young woman loosed the bonds of the captives, who immediately descended and danced while the lute players sang beautiful canzone. At least so says Gagnolo. The cultured Duchess of Mantua, however, wrote that the music was so doleful that it was scarcely worth listening to. Isabella, however, judging by her remarkable letters, was a severe critic not only of the plays but of all the festivities. The 4th moresca was danced by 10 Moors holding burning tapers in their mouths. In the 5th there were 10 fantastically dressed men with feathers on their heads and bearing lances with small lighted torches at their tips. On the conclusion of the Epidicus, there was a performance by several jugglers. Friday, February 4th, Lucretia did not appear until the afternoon. In the morning, the Duke showed his guests about the city, and they went to see a famous saint, Sister Lucia of Viterbo, whom the devout Ercole had brought to Ferrara as a great attraction. Every Friday, the 5 wounds of Christ appeared on the body of this saint. She presented the ambassador of France with a rag with which she had touched her scars, and which Monsignor Roccoberti received with great respect. At the castle, the Duke showed his guests the artillery, to the study of which his son Alfonso was eagerly devoted. Here they waited for Lucretia, who, accompanied by all the ambassadors, soon appeared in the great salon. A dance was given, which lasted until 6 in the evening. Then followed a presentation of the Bacchides, which required 5 hours. Isabella found these performances excessively long and tiresome. Ballets similar to those which accompanied the Epidicus were given. Men dressed in flesh-colored tights with torches in their hands, which diffused agreeable odors, danced fantastic figures, and engaged in a battle with a dragon. The following day, Lucretia did not appear, as she was engaged in writing letters and in washing her hair, and the guests amused themselves by wandering about the city. No entertainments were given for the populace. The French ambassador, in the name of the King of France, sent presents to the princes of the house. The Duke received a golden shield with a picture of St. Francis in enamel, the work of a Parisian artist, which was highly valued. To the hereditary Prince Alfonso was given a similar shield with a portrait of Mary of Magdala, the ambassador remarking that His Majesty had chosen a wife who resembled the Magdalene in character. Quo multum meruit, quia multum creditit. Perhaps presenting Alfonso with the gifts suggested of the Magdalene was an intentional bit of irony on the part of the French king. In addition to this, he received a written description of a process for casting cannon. A golden shield was likewise presented to Don Ferrante. Lucretia's gift was a string of gold beads filled with musk, while her charming maid of honor, Angela, was honored with a costly chain. Everything was done to flatter the French ambassador. He was invited to dinner in the evening by the Marchioness of Mantua, and was placed between his hostess and the Duchess of Urbino. The evening was passed, according to Gagnolo, in gallant and cultivated conversation. On leaving the table, the Marchioness sang the most beautiful songs to the accompaniment of the lute for the entertainment of the French ambassador. After this, she conducted him to her chamber, where, in the presence of 2 of her ladies-in-waiting, they held an animated conversation for almost an hour, at the conclusion of which she drew off her gloves and presented them to him. Quote, "And the ambassador received them with assurances of his loyalty and his love, as they came from such a charming source. He told her that he would preserve them until the end of time as a precious relic." We may believe Gagnolo, for doubtless the fortunate ambassador regarded this memento of a beautiful woman as no less precious than the rag poor Saint Lucia had given him. Sunday, February 6th, there was a magnificent ceremony in the church. One of the Pope's chamberlains, in the name of His Holiness, presented Don Alfonso with a hat and also a sword which the Holy Father had blessed, and which the Archbishop girded on him at the altar. In the afternoon, the princes and princesses of the house of Este went to Lucretia's apartments to fetch her to the banquet hall. They danced for 2 hours, Lucretia herself, with one of her ladies-in-waiting, taking part in some French dances. In the evening, the Miles Gloriosus was presented. It was followed by a Moresca, in which 10 shepherds, with horns on their heads, fought with each other. February 7th, there was a tournée in the piazza before the church between 2 mounted knights, one of whom was a native of Bologna and the other a citizen of Imola. No blood was shed. In the evening, the Asinaria was presented, together with a wonderful Moresca, in which appeared 14 satyrs, one of which carried a silvered ass's head in his hands, in which there was a music box, to the strains of which the clowns danced. This play of the satyrs was followed by an interlude performed by 16 vocalists, men and women, and a virtuoso from Mantua who played on 3 lutes. In conclusion, there was a Moresca in which was simulated the agricultural work of the peasants. The fields were prepared, the seed sown, the grain cut and threshed, and the harvest feast followed. Finally, a native dance to the accompaniment of the bagpipe was executed. The last day of the festivities, February 8th, also marked the end of the carnival. The ambassadors, who were soon to depart, presented the bride with costly gifts consisting of beautiful stuffs and silverware. The most remarkable present was brought by the representatives of Venice. The Republic, at its own expense, had sent 2 noblemen to the festivities, Niccolò Dolfini and Andrea Foscolo, both of whom were magnificently clothed. In those days, dress was as costly as it was beautiful, and the artists who made the clothes for the men and women of the Renaissance would look with contempt upon those of the present time, for in that aesthetic age their productions were works of art. The most magnificent stuffs, velvet, silk, and gold embroidery were used, and painters did not scorn to design the color schemes and the shapes and folds of the garments. Dress, therefore, was a most weighty consideration, and one to which great value was attached, as it indicated the importance of the wearer. All who have left accounts of the festivities in Ferrara describe in detail the costumes worn on each occasion by Donna Lucretia and the other prominent women, and even those of the men. The reports which the Venetians sent home and the description in the diary of Marino Sanuto show how great was the importance attached to these matters. The following is even more striking evidence. Before the 2 ambassadors of Venice set out for Ferrara, they were required to appear before the whole Senate in their robes of crimson velvet trimmed with fur, and wearing capes of similar material. More than 4,000 persons were present in the great council hall, and the Piazza of San Marco was crowded with people who gazed with wonder on these strange creatures. One of the robes contained 32 and the other 28 yards of velvet. Following the instructions of the Signory of Venice, the ambassadors sent their robes to Duchess Lucretia as a bridal gift. This wonderful gift was presented in the most naive way imaginable. One of the noble gentlemen delivered a Latin oration, and the other followed with a long discourse in Italian. Thereupon they retired to an adjoining room, removed their magnificent robes, and sent them to the bride. This present and the pedantry of the two Venetians excited the greatest mirth at the Ferrarese court. In the evening they danced for the last time, and attended the final theatrical performance, the Casina. Before the comedy began, music composed by Romboncino was rendered, and songs in honor of the young couple were sung. Everywhere throughout the Casina, musical interludes were introduced. During the intermission, 6 violinists, among them Don Alfonso, the hereditary prince, who was a magnificent amateur performer, played. The violin seemed to have been held in great esteem in Ferrara, for when Caesar Borgia was about to set out for France, he asked Duke Ercole for a violin player to accompany him, as they were much sought after in that country. The ballet which followed was a dance of savages contending for the possession of a beautiful woman. Suddenly the god of love appeared, accompanied by musicians, and set her free. Hereupon the spectators discovered a great globe, which suddenly split in halves and began to give forth beautiful strains. In conclusion, 12 Swiss armed with halberds and wearing their national colors entered and executed an artistic dance, fencing the while. If this scene, as Cognolo says, ended the dramatic performances, we are forced to conclude that they were exceedingly dull and spiritless. The Moresca partook of the character of both the opera and the ballet. It was the only new form of spectacle offered during all the festivities. Compared with those which were given in Rome on the occasion of Lucretia's betrothal, they were much inferior. Among the former, we notice several pastoral comedies with allegorical allusions to Lucretia, Ferrara, Caesar, and Alexander. In spite of the outlay the Duke had made, his entertainments lacked novelty and variety, although they probably pleased most of those present. Isabella, however, did not hesitate to mention the fact that she was bored. In truth, so she wrote her husband, the wedding was a very cold affair. It seems 1,000 years before I shall be in Mantua again. I am so anxious to see your Majesty and my son, and also to get away from this place where I find absolutely no pleasure. Your Excellency, therefore, need not envy me my present at this wedding. It is so stiff, I have much more cause to envy those who remained in Mantua. Apparently the noble lady's opinion was influenced by the displeasure she still felt on account of her brother's marriage with Lucretia, but it may also have been due partly to the character of the festivities themselves, for the Marchese in all her letters complains of their being tiresome. Soon after the conclusion of the festivities, the Marchioness returned to Mantua. Her last letter from Ferrara to her husband is dated February 9th. Her first letter from Mantua to her sister-in-law, which was written February 18th, is as follows. Illustrious Lady, the love which I feel for your Majesty, and my hope that you continue in the same good health in which you were at the time of my departure, cause me to believe that you have the same feelings for me. Therefore I inform you, hoping that it will be pleasant news to you, that I returned to this city on Monday in the best of health, and that I found my illustrious consort also well. There is nothing more for me to write, but to ask your Majesty to tell me how you are, for I rejoice like an own sister in your welfare. Although I regard it as superfluous to offer you what belongs to you, I will remind you once for all, I and mine are ever at your disposal. I am also much beholden to you, and I ask you to remember me to your illustrious consort, my most honored brother. Lucretia replied to the Marchioness' letter as follows. My illustrious lady, sister-in-law, and most honored sister, although it was my duty to anticipate your Excellency in the proof of affection which you have given me, this neglect on my part only makes me all the more beholden to you. I can never tell you with what pleasure and relief I learned that you had reached Mantua safely and had found your illustrious husband well. May he and your Majesty, with God's help, continue to enjoy all happiness and the increase of all good things, according to your desires. In obedience to your Majesty's commands, I am compelled, and I also desire to let you know that I, by God's mercy, am well, and shall ever be disposed to serve you. Your devoted sister, who is anxious to serve you, Lucretia de Borgia. Ferrara, February 22nd, 1502. These letters, written with diplomatic cunning, are the beginning of the correspondence of these two famous women, which was carried on for 17 years, and which shows that Isabella's displeasure gradually passed away, and that she became a real friend of her sister-in-law. The Duke was heartily glad when his guests finally departed. Madonna Adriana, Girolama, and the woman described simply as, quote, an Orsini, seemed in no haste to return to Rome. Alexander had instructed them to remain until Caesar's wife arrived. They were to wait for her in Lombardy, and then accompany her to Rome. The Duchess of Romagna, however, in spite of the urgent requests of the nuncio, refused to leave France. Her brother, Cardinal d'Albret, reached Ferrara February 6 and shortly after set out for Rome. Adriana, as a near connection of the Pope and Lucretia, had been treated with the highest respect at Ercole's court, where she had enjoyed a close intimacy with the Marchioness Isabella, as is shown by a letter which the latter addressed to Adriana, February 18th, the same day on which she wrote Lucretia. It is regarding a certain person whom Adriana, while in Ferrara, had recommended to her in her own name and also in that of Donna Giulia. It therefore appears that the anonymous Orsini was not Giulia Farnese. Ercole was exceedingly anxious for the women to leave. In a letter dated February 14th to his ambassador in Rome, Costabili, he complains bitterly about their, quote, useless stay at his court. I tell you, so he wrote, that these women, by remaining here, cause a large number of other persons, men as well as women, to linger, for all wish to depart at the same time, and it is a great burden and causes heavy expense. The retinue of these ladies, taken into consideration with the other people, numbers not far from 450 persons and 350 horses. Ercole instructed his ambassador to inform the Pope of this and also to tell him that the supplies were about exhausted, and that the Duchess of Romagna would not arrive before Easter, and that he could stand the expense no longer, as the wedding festivities had already cost 25,000 ducats. The Pope should therefore direct the ladies to return. In a postscript to the same letter, the Duke says, quote, after the noble ladies of the Duchess of Romagna had been here 12 days, I sent them away because they were impertinent, and because their presence would not do His Holiness or the Duchess any good. The troublesome women finally departed. There is a despatch of the orator Girardo Saraceni, dated Rome, May 4th, in which he informs the Duke that Monsignor Venosa and Donna Adriana had returned from Ferrara and had expressed to the Pope their gratitude for the affectionate reception which had been accorded them. February 14th, Ercole wrote the Pope a letter whose meaning is perfectly clear if we eliminate one or two phrases. Holy Father and Master, before the illustrious Duchess, our daughter, came here, it was my firm determination to receive her, as was met, with all friendliness and honor, and to show her in every way how great was the affection I felt for her. Now that Her Majesty is here, I am so pleased with her on account of the virtues and good qualities which I have discovered in her, that I am not only strengthened in that determination, but also am resolved to do even more than I had intended, and all the more because Your Holiness has asked me to do so in the autographic letter which you wrote me. Your Holiness need have no fears, for I shall treat the Duchess in such a way that Your Holiness will see that I regard her as the most precious jewel I have in the world. End of Chapter 3. Section 26 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 4, The Este Dynasty, Description of Ferrara. On entering the castle of the Este, Lucretia found a new environment, new interests, one might almost say a new world. She was a princess in one of the most important Italian states and in a strange city, which, during the latter half of the century, had assumed a place of the first importance, for the spirit of Italian culture had there developed new forms. She had been received with the highest honors into a family famous and princely, one of the oldest and most brilliant in the peninsula. It was a piece of supreme good fortune that had brought her to this house, and now she would endeavor to make herself worthy of it. The family of Este, next to that of Savoy, was the oldest and most illustrious in Italy, and it forced the latter into the background by assuming the important position which the state of Ferrara, owing to its geographical position, afforded it. The history of the Este is briefly as follows. These lords, whose name is derived from a small castle between Padua and Ferrara, and who first appeared about the time of the Lombard invasion, were descended from a family whose remote ancestor was one Albert. The names Adalbert and Albert assume in Italian the form Oberto, from which we have the diminutives of Obizzo and Azzo. In the 10th century there appears a Marquis Oberto, who was first a retainer of King Berengar and later of Otto the Great. It is not known from what domain he and his immediate successor derived their title of Marquis. They were, however, powerful lords in Lombardy as well as in Tuscany. One of Oberto's ancestors, Alberto Azzo II, who was originally mentioned as Marchio di Longobardia, governed the territory from Mantua to the Adriatic and the region about the Po, where he owned Este and Rovigo. He married Kunigunde, sister of Count Guelph III of Swabia, and in this way the famous German family of Guelph became connected with the Oberti and drawn into Italian politics. When Alberto Azzo died in the year 1096, more than 100 years old, he left two sons, Guelph and Folco, who were the founders of the House of Este in Italy and the Guelph House of Braunschweig in Germany. For Guelph inherited the property of his maternal grandfather, Guelph III, in whom the male line of the house became extinct in the year 1055. He went to Germany, where he became Duke of Bavaria and founded the Guelph line. Folco inherited his father's Italian possessions, and in the great struggle of the German emperor with the papacy, the Margraves of Este were aggressive and determined soldiers. At first they were simply members of the Guelph faction, but subsequently they became its leaders, and thus were able to establish their power in Ferrara. The origin of the city is lost in the mists of antiquity. By the gift of Pippin and Charles, it passed to the Church. It was also included in the deed of Matilda. In the war between the Pope and the Emperor, occasioned by this gift of Matilda, Ferrara succeeded in regaining its independence as a republic. The Este first appeared there about the end of the 12th century. Folco's grandson, Azzo V, married Marcheselle Adelardi, who was the heir of the leader of the Guelphs in that city, where Salinguerra was head of the Ghibellines. From that time the Margraves of Este possessed great influence in Ferrara. They were likewise leaders of the Guelph party in the north of Italy. In the year 1208, Azzo VI succeeded in driving Salinguerra out of Ferrara, and the city, having wearied of the long feud, made the victor its hereditary podestà. This is the first example of a free republic voluntarily submitting to a lord. In this way, the Este established the first tyranny on the ruins of a commune. The brave Salinguerra, one of the greatest captains of Italy in the time of the Hohenstaufen, repeatedly drove Azzo VI and his successor Azzo VII from Ferrara, but he himself was finally defeated in 1240 and cast into prison, where he died. Thenceforth the Este ruled Ferrara. About the time of the removal of the papacy to Avignon, they were expelled from the city by the Church, but they returned on the invitation of the citizens who had risen against the papal legate. John the 22nd issued a diploma of investiture, by the terms of which they were to hold Ferrara as a fief of the Church on payment of an annual tribute of 10,000 gold ducats. The Este now set themselves up as tyrants in Ferrara, and in spite of numerous wars maintained the dynasty for a great many years. This dominion was not, like that in many other Italian states, due to a lucky stroke on the part of an upstart, but it was ancient, hereditary, and firmly established. It was due to a succession of remarkable princes, beginning with Aldobrandino, Lord of Ferrara, Modena, Rovigo, and Comacchio, that Ferrara succeeded in winning the important position she held at the beginning of the 16th century. Aldobrandino was followed by his brothers Niccolò from 1361 to 1388, and Alberto until 1393. After that, his son Niccolò III, a powerful and bellicose man, ruled until the year 1441. As his legitimate children, Ercole and Sigismondo, were minors, he was succeeded by his natural son, Lionello. This prince not only continued the work begun by his father, but also beautified Ferrara. In the year 1444, the great Alfonso of Naples gave him his daughter Maria as wife, and the Este thus entered into close relations with the royal house of Aragon. Lionello was intelligent and liberal, a patron of all the arts and sciences, a, quote, prince of immortal name. In the year 1450, he was succeeded by his brother Borso, illegitimate like himself, as an effort was being made to displace the legitimate sons of Niccolò II. Borso was one of the most magnificent princes of his age. Frederick II, when he stopped in Ferrara on his return from his coronation in Rome, made him Duke of Modena and Reggio, and Count of Rovigo and Comacchio, all of which territories belonged to the empire. The Este thereupon adopted for their arms, instead of the white eagle they had hitherto borne, the black eagle of the empire, to which were added the lilies of France, the use of which had been granted them by Charles VII. April 14, 1471, Paul VII in Rome created Borso Duke of Ferrara. Soon after this, May 27th, this celebrated prince died unmarried and childless. He was succeeded by Ercole, the legitimate son of Niccolò II, the direct line of the Este, thereby reacquiring the government of Ferrara, the importance of the state having been greatly increased by the efforts of the two illegitimate sons. In June 1473, amid magnificent festivities, Ercole married Eleonora of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand of Naples. 29 years of conflict, had passed when the second Duke of Ferrara married his son to Lucretia with similar pomp. By putting an end to the war with Venice and Pope Sixtus IV in the year 1482, Ercole had succeeded in saving his state from the great danger which threatened it, although he had been forced to relinquish certain territory to the Venetians. This danger, however, might arise again, for Venice and the Pope continued to be Ferrara's bitterest enemies. Political considerations, therefore, compelled her to form an alliance with France, whose king already owned Milan and might permanently secure possession of Naples. For the same reason, he had married his son to Lucretia on the best terms he was able to make. She, therefore, must have been conscious of her great importance to the state of Ferrara, and this it was which gave her a sense of security with regard to the noble house to which she now belonged. The Duke presented the young couple Castelvecchio for the residence, and there Lucretia established her court. This stronghold, which is still in existence, is one of the most imposing monuments of the Middle Ages. It overlooks all Ferrara and may be seen for miles around. Its dark red color, its gloominess, which is partly due to its architectural severity, its 4 mighty towers, all combine to cause a feeling of fear, especially on moonlit nights, when the shadows of the towers fall on the water in the moat, which still surrounds the castle as in days of old. The figures of the great ones who once lived in the stronghold, Ugo e Parisina Malatesta, Borso, Lucretia Borgia and Alfonso, René of France, and Calvin, Ariosto, Alfonso II, the unfortunate Tasso and Eleonora, seem to rise before the beholder. The Marchese Niccolò, owing to an uprising of the citizens, began Castelvecchio in the year 1385, and his successor completed it and decorated the interior. It is connected by covered passageways with a palace opposite the church. Before Ercole extended Ferrara on the north, The castle marked the boundary of the city. One of the towers, called the Tower of the Lions, protected the city gate. A branch of the Po, which at that time flowed nearby, supplied the moat, over which there were several drawbridges, with water. In Lucretia's time, the only main features of the stronghold were the same as they are now. The cornices of the towers are of a later date, and the towers themselves were somewhat lower. The walls were embattled like those of the Gonzaga castle in Mantua. Cannons, cast under the direction of Alfonso, were placed at various points. There is an interior quadrangular court with arcades, and there Lucretia was shown the place where Niccolo II had caused his son Ugo and his stepmother, the beautiful Parisina, to be beheaded. This gruesome deed was a warning to Alexander's daughter to be true to her husband. A wide marble stairway led to the two upper stories of the castle, one of which, the lower, consisting of a series of chambers and salons, was set aside for the princes. In the course of time, this has suffered so many changes that even those most thoroughly acquainted with Ferrara do not know just where Lucretia's apartments were. Very few of the paintings with which the Este adorned the castle are left. There are still some frescoes by Dossi and another unknown master. The castle was always a gloomy and oppressive residence. It was in perfect accord with the character of Ferrara, which even now is forbidding. Standing on the battlements and looking across the broad, highly cultivated but monotonous fields, whose horizon is not attractive because the Veronese Alps are too far distant, and the Apennines, which are closer, are not clearly defined, and gazing down upon the black mass of the city itself, one wonders how Ariosto's exuberant creation could have been produced here. Greater inspiration would be found in the sky, the land, and the sea of the idyllic Sorrento, which was Tasso's birthplace, but this is only another proof of the theory that the poet's fancy is independent of his environment. Ferrara is situated in an unhealthful plain, which is traversed by a branch of the Po and several canals. The principal stream does not contribute to the life of the city or its suburbs, as it is several miles distant. The town is surrounded by strong walls in which are 4 gates. In addition to Castel Vecchio on the north, there was, in Lucretia's time, another at the southwest, Castel Tealto or Tedaldo, which was situated on one of the branches of the Po, and which had a gate opening into the city and a pontoon bridge connecting it with the suburb San Giorgio. Lucretia had entered by this gate. Nothing is now left of Castel Tedaldo, as it was razed at the beginning of the 17th century, when the Pope, having driven out Alfonso's successors, erected the new fortress. Ferrara has a large public square and regular streets with arcades. The church, which faces the principal piazza and which was consecrated in the year 1135, is an imposing structure in the Lombardo Gothic style. Its high facade is divided in 3 parts and gabled, and it has 3 rows of half-Roman and half-Gothic arches supported on columns. With its ancient sculptures, black with time, it presents a strange appearance of medieval originality and romance. In Ferrara there is now nothing else so impressive on first sight as this church. It seems as if one of the structures of Ariosto's fairy world had suddenly risen before us. Opposite one side of the castle, the Palazzo del Ragione is still standing, and there are also 2 old towers, one of which is called the Rigobello. Opposite the facade was the Este Palace, in which Ercole lived and which Eugene IV occupied when he held the famous council in Ferrara. In front of it rose the monuments of the 2 great princes of the House of Este, Niccolo III and Borso. One is an equestrian statue, the other a sitting figure. Both were placed upon columns and therefore are small. The crumbling pillars by the entrance archway are still standing, but the statues were destroyed in 1796. The Este vied with the other princes and republics in building churches and convents, of which Ferrara still possesses a large number. In the year 1500, the most important were San Domenico, San Francesco, Santa Maria in Vado, Sant'Antonio, San Giorgio before the Porta Romana, the convent Corpus Domini, and the Certosa. All have been restored more or less, and although some of them are roomy and beautiful, none have any special artistic individuality. As early as the 15th century, there were numerous palaces in Ferrara which are still numbered among the attractions of the gloomy city, and which are regarded as important structures in the history of architecture, from the early Renaissance until the appearance of the Rococo style. Many of them, however, are in a deplorable state of decay. Marchese Alberto built the Palazzo del Paradiso, now the University, and Schifanoia at the end of the 16th century. Ercole erected the Palazzo Pareschi. He also restored a large part of Ferrara and extended the city by adding a new quarter on the north, the Addizione Ercolea, which is still the handsomest part of Ferrara. The city is traversed by two long, wide streets, the Corso di Porta Po, with its continuation, the Corso di Porta Mare, and the Strada dei Piopponi. Strolling through these quiet streets, one is astonished at the long rows of beautiful palaces of the Renaissance, reminders of a teeming life now passed away. Ercole laid out a large square which is surrounded by noble palaces, and which is now known as the Piazza Ariostoia, from the monument of the great poet which stands in the center. This is, doubtless, the most beautiful memorial ever erected to a poet. The marble statue stands upon a high column and looks down upon the entire city. The history of the monument is interesting. Originally, it was intended that an equestrian statue of Ercole on two columns should occupy this position. When the columns were being brought down the Po on a raft, one of them rolled overboard and was lost. The other was used in the year 1675 to support the statue of Pope Alexander VII, which was pulled down during the Revolution of 1796 and replaced with a Statue of Liberty, the unveiling of which was attended by General Napoleon Bonaparte. 3 years later, the Austrians overthrew the Statue of Liberty, leaving the column standing, and in the year 1810 a statue of the Emperor Napoleon was placed upon it. This fell with the emperor. In the year 1833, Ferrara set Ariosto's statue upon the column, where it will remain in spite of all political change. Magnificent palaces rose in Ercole's new suburb. His brother, Sigismondo, erected the splendid Palazzo Diamanti, now Ferrara's art gallery, while the Trotti, Castelli, Sacrati, and Bevilacqua families built palaces there which are still in existence. Ferrara was the home of a wealthy nobility, some of whom belonged to the old baronial families. In addition, there were the Contrari, Pio, Costabili, the Strozzi, Saraceni, Boschetti, the Roverella, the Muzzarelli, and Pendalia. The Ferrarese aristocracy had long ago emerged from the state of municipal strife and feudal dependence, and had set up their courts. The Este, especially, the warlike Niccolo III, had subjugated the barons, who originally lived upon their estates beyond the city walls, and who were now in the service of the ruling family, holding the most important court and city offices. They were also commanders in the army. They took part, probably more actively than did the nobility of the other Italian states, in the intellectual movement of the age, which was fostered by the princes of the House of Este. Consequently, many of these great lords won prominent places in the history of literature in Ferrara. The university, which had flourished there since the middle of the 15th century, was, excepting those of Padua and Bologna, the most famous in Italy. Founded by the Margrave Alberto in 1391, and subsequently remodeled by Niccolo III, it reached the zenith of its fame in the time of Lionello and Borso. The former was a pupil of the celebrated Guarino of Verona, and was himself acquainted with all the sciences. The friend and idol of the humanists of his age, he collected rare manuscripts and disseminated copies of them. He founded the library, and Borso continued the work begun by him. As early as 1474, the University of Ferrara had 45 well-paid professors, and Ercole increased their number. Printing was introduced during his reign. The earliest printer in Ferrara after 1471 was the Frenchman Andreas, called Belfort. Like the city, the people seem to have been of a serious cast of mind, which led to speculation, criticism, and the cultivation of the exact sciences. From Ferrara came Savonarola, the fanatical prophet who appeared during the moral blight which characterized the age of the Borgias, and Lucretia must frequently have recalled this man in whom her father, by the executioner's hand, sought to stifle the protestations of the faithful and upright against the immorality of his rule. Astronomy and mathematics, and especially the natural sciences and medicine, which at that time were part of the school of philosophy, were extensively cultivated in Ferrara. It is stated that Savonarola himself had studied medicine. His grandfather Michele, a famous physician of Padua, had been called to Ferrara by Niccolò II. Niccolò Leoniceno, a native of Vicenza, at whose feet many of the most famous scholars and poets had sat, enjoyed great renown in Ferrara about 1464 as a physician, mathematician, philosopher, and philologist. He was still the pride of the city when Lucretia arrived there, as the great mathematician Domenico Maria Novara was then teaching in Bologna, where Copernicus had been his pupil. Many famous humanists, who at the time of Lucretia's arrival were still children or youths, for example the Giraldi and genial Celio Calcagnini, who dedicated an epithalamium to her on her appearance in the city, were members of the Ferrarese University. All of these men were welcome at the court of the Este because they were accomplished and versatile. It was not until later, after the sciences had been classified and their boundaries defined, that the graceful learning of the humanists degenerated into pedantry. It was, however, especially the art of poetry which gave Ferrara in Lucretia's time a peculiarly romantic cast. This it was which first attracted attention to the city as one of the main centers of the intellectual movement. Ferrara produced numerous poets who composed in both tongues, Latin and Italian. Almost all the scholars of the day wrote Latin verses. Most of them, however, it must be admitted, were lacking in poetic fire. Some of the Ferrarese, however, rose to high positions in poetry and are still remembered. Preeminent were the two Strozzi, father and son, and Antonio Tebaldeo. The poets, however, who originated the romantic epic in Italian were much more important than the writers of Latin verse. The brilliant and sensuous court of Ferrara, together with the fascinating romance of the House of Este, which really belongs to the Middle Ages, and the charming nobility and modern chivalry, all contributed to the production of the epic, while the city of Ferrara, with its eventful history and its striking style of architecture, was a most favorable soil for it. Monuments of Roman antiquity are as rare in Ferrara as they are in Florence. Everything is of the Middle Ages. Lucretia did not meet Boiardo, the famous author of the Orlando Innamorato, at the court of his friend Ercole, but the blind singer of the Mambriano, Francesco Cecco, probably was still living. We have seen how Ariosto, who was soon to eclipse all his predecessors, greeted Lucretia on her arrival. The graphic arts had made much less progress in Ferrara than had poetry and the sciences, but while no master of the first rank, no Raphael or Titian appeared, there were nevertheless some who won a not unimportant place in the history of Italian culture. The Este were patrons of painting. They had their palaces decorated with frescoes, some of which, still considered noteworthy on account of their originality, are preserved in the Palazzo Schifanoia, where they were rediscovered in the year 1840. About the middle of the 15th century, Ferrara had its own school, the chief of which was Cosimo Tura. It produced two remarkable painters, Dosso Dossi and Benvenuto Tizio, the latter of whom, under the name of Garofalo, became famous as one of Raphael's greatest pupils. The works of these artists, who were Lucretia's contemporaries, Garofalo being a year younger, still adorn many of the churches and are the chief attractions in the galleries of the city. Such, broadly sketched, was the intellectual life of Ferrara in the year 1502. We therefore see that in addition to her brilliant court and her political importance as the capital of the state, she possessed a highly developed spiritual life. The chroniclers state that her population at that time numbered 100,000 souls, and at the beginning of the 16th century, her most flourishing period, she was probably more populous than Rome. In addition to the nobility, there was an active bourgeoisie engaged in commerce and manufacturing, especially weaving, who enjoyed life. End of Chapter 4. Section 27 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 5, Death of Alexander VI. Alexander carefully followed everything that took place in Ferrara. He never lost sight of his daughter. She and his agents reported every mark of favor or disfavor which he received. Following the excitement of the wedding festivities, there were painful days for Lucretia, as she was forced to meet envy and contempt and to win for herself a secure place at the court. Alexander was greatly pleased by her reports, especially those concerning her relations with Alfonso. He never for a moment supposed that the hereditary prince loved his daughter. All he required was that he should treat her as his wife, and that she should become the mother of a prince. With great satisfaction he remarked to the Ferrarese ambassador on hearing that Alfonso spent his nights with Lucretia. Quote, "During the day he goes wherever he likes, as he is young, and in doing this he does right." Alexander also induced the Duke to grant his daughter-in-law a larger allowance than he had agreed to give her. The sum stipulated was 6,000 ducats. Lucretia was extravagant and needed a large income. The amount she received from her father-in-law did not, however, exceed 10,000 ducats. In the meantime, Caesar was pursuing his own schemes, the success of which was apparently ensured by his alliance with Ferrara and the sanction of France. The youthful Astore Manfredi, having been strangled in the castle of Sant'Angelo by his orders, Valentino set out for Romagna, June 13th, where he succeeded in ensnaring the unsuspecting Guidobaldo of Urbino, and in seizing his estates, June 21st. Guidobaldo fled and found an asylum in Mantua, whence he and his wife eventually went to Venice. Caesar now turned toward Camerino, where he surprised the Varano, destroying all but one of them. He reported these doings to the court of Ferrara, and the Duke did not hesitate to congratulate him for a crime which had resulted in the overthrow of princes who were not only friendly to himself, but were also closely connected with him. From Urbino, Caesar wrote his sister as follows. Illustrious lady and dearest sister, I know nothing could be better medicine for your excellency in your present illness than the good news which I have to impart. I must tell you that I have just had information that Camerino will yield. We trust that on receiving this news your condition will rapidly improve, and that you will inform us at once of it. For your indisposition prevents us from deriving any pleasure from this and other news. We ask you to tell the illustrious Duke Don Alfonso, your husband, our brother-in-law, at once, as owing to want of time we have not been able to write him direct. Your Majesty's brother, who loves you better than he does himself, Caesar. Urbino, July 20th, 1502. Shortly after this, he surprised his sister by visiting her in the palace of Belfiore, whither he came in disguise with 5 cavaliers. He remained with her scarcely 2 hours, and then hastily departed, accompanied by his brother-in-law Alfonso as far as Modena, intending to go to the King of France, who was in Lombardy. In the meantime, Alexander had arrived at a decision regarding the seizure of Camerino, which conflicted with Caesar's plans, and which shows that the father's will was not wholly under his son's control. September 2nd, 1502, Alexander bestowed Camerino as a duchy upon the Infante Giovanni Borgia, whom he sometimes described as his own son and at others as Caesar's. Giovanni had already been invested with the title of Neppi, and Francesco Borgia, Cardinal of Cosenza, as the child's guardian, administered these estates. There are coins of this ephemeral Duke of Camerino still in existence. September 5th, Lucretia gave birth to a stillborn daughter, to the great disappointment of Alexander, who desired an heir to the throne. She was sick unto death, and her husband showed the deepest concern, seldom leaving her for a moment. September 7th, Valentino came to see her. The secretary Castellus sent a report of this visit to Ercole, who was in Reggio, whither he had gone to meet Caesar, who was returning from Lombardy. "Today," he wrote, "at the 20th hour, we bled Madama on the right foot. It was exceedingly difficult to accomplish it, and we could not have done it but for the Duke of Romagna, who held her foot. Her Majesty spent 2 hours with the Duke, who made her laugh and cheered her greatly." Lucretia had a codicil added to her will, which she had made before leaving for Ferrara, in the presence of her brother's secretary and some monks. She, however, recovered. Caesar remained with her 2 days, and then departed for Imola. When Ercole returned, he found his daughter-in-law attended by Alexander's most skilful physician, the Bishop of Venosa, and out of all danger. As Lucretia felt oppressed in Castel Vecchio, and yearned for the free air, she removed October 8th, accompanied by the entire court, to the convent of Corpus Domini. Her recovery was so rapid that she was able again to take up a residence in the castle October 22nd, to the great joy of everyone, as Duke Ercole wrote to Rome. Alfonso even went to Loreto in fulfillment of a vow he had made for the recovery of his wife. The solicitude which was displayed for Lucretia on this occasion shows that she had begun to make herself beloved in Ferrara. In this same month of October occurred the disaffection of Caesar's condottieri, which nearly ended in his overthrow. In consequence of the desertion of his generals, the country about Urbino rose, and Guidobaldo even succeeded in re-entering his capital city October 18th. The protection of France and the lack of decision on the part of his enemies, however, saved the Duke of Romagna from the danger which threatened him. December 31st, he relieved himself of the barons by the well-known coup of Senigallia. This was his masterstroke. He had Vitellozzo and Oliverotto strangled forthwith. The Orsini, Paolo, father-in-law of Girolamo Borgia, and Francesco, Duke of Gravina, who had once been mentioned as a possible husband for Lucretia, suffered the same fate January 18, 1503. The Duke of Ferrara congratulated Caesar, as did also the Gonzaga. Even Isabella did not hesitate to write a graceful letter to the man that had driven her dear sister-in-law, whose husband had been forced to flee a second time, from Urbino. The Gonzaga, who were anxious to marry the little hereditary Prince Federico to his daughter Luisa, were endeavoring to secure this end with the help of Francesco Trocchio in Rome. Isabella's contemptible letter to Caesar is as follows. To His Highness the Duke of Valentino. Illustrious Sir, the happy progress of which your Excellency has been good enough to inform us in your amiable letter has caused us all the liveliest joy, owing to the friendship and interest which you and my illustrious husband feel for each other. We therefore congratulate you in his and our name for the good fortune which has befallen you, and for your safety, and we thank you for informing us of it and for your offer to keep us advised of future events, which we hope will be no less favorable, for loving you as we do, we hope to hear from you often regarding your plans so that we may be able to rejoice with you at the success and advancements of your Excellency. Believing that you, after the excitement and fatigue which you have suffered while engaged in your glorious undertakings, will be disposed to give some time to recreation, it seems proper to me to send you by our courier, Giovanni, 100 masks. We, of course, know how slight is this present in proportion to the greatness of your Excellency, and also in proportion to our desires. Still, it indicates that if there were anything more worthy and more suitable in this our country, we certainly would send it you. If the masks, however, are not as beautiful as they ought to be, your Highness will know that this is due to the makers in Ferrara, who, as it has been for years against the law to wear masks, long ago ceased making them. May, however, our good intentions and our love make up for their shortcomings. So far as our own affairs are concerned, there is nothing new to tell you until your Excellency informs us as to the decision of His Holiness, our Master, concerning the articles of guarantee upon which we, through Brognolo, have agreed. We therefore look forward to this and hope to reach a satisfactory conclusion. We commend ourselves to your service. January 15th, 1503. Caesar replied to the Marchioness from Acquapendente as follows. Most illustrious lady, friend, and honored sister, we have received your Excellency's present of the 100 masks, which, owing to their diversity and beauty, are very welcome, and because the time and place of their arrival could not have been more propitious. If we neglected to inform your Excellency of all our plans and of our intended return to Rome, it was because it was only today that we succeeded in taking the city and territory adjacent to Senigallia together with a fortress, and punished our enemies for their treachery. Freed Città di Castello, Fermo, Cisterna, Montone, and Perugia from their tyrants, and rendered them again subject to His Holiness our Master, and deposed Pandolfo Petrucci from the tyranny which he had established in Siena, where he had shown himself such a determined enemy of ourselves. The masks are welcome especially because I know that the present is due to the affection which you and your illustrious husband feel for us, which is also shown by the letter which you send with it. Therefore we thank you 1,000 times, although the magnitude of your and your husband's deserts exceeds the power of words. We shall use the masks, and they are so beautiful that we shall be saved the trouble of providing ourselves with any other adornment. On returning to Rome, we will see that His Holiness, our Master, does whatever is necessary to further our mutual interests. We, in compliance with your Excellency's request, will grant the prisoner his liberty. We will inform your illustrious Majesty at once, so that you may rejoice in it the moment he is free. We commend ourselves to you. From the Papal Camp near Acquapendente, February 1st. Your Excellency's friend and brother, the Duke of Romagna, etc. Caesar. Caesar was then near the zenith of his desires, a king's throne in central Italy. This project, however, was never realized. Louis XII forbade him further conquests. The Orsini, the cardinal of this house, had just been poisoned in the castle of Sant'Angelo, and other barons whose estates were in the vicinity of Rome rose for the final struggle, and Caesar was compelled to hasten back to the papal city. Alexander and his son now turned towards Spain, as Gonsalvo had defeated the French in Naples and had entered the capital of the kingdom May 14th. Louis XII, however, dispatched a new army under La Tremouille to recapture Naples. The Marquis of Mantua was likewise in his pay, and in August 1503 the army entered the Patricium Petri. Alexander and Caesar were suddenly taken sick at the same moment. The Pope died August 18th. It has been affirmed and also denied that both were poisoned, and proofs equally good in support of both views have been adduced. It is therefore a mooted question. Aside from her grief due to affection, the death of Lucretia's father was a serious event for her, as it might weaken her position in Ferrara. Alexander's power was all that had given her a sense of security, and now she could no longer feel certain of the continuance of the affection of her father-in-law or of that of her husband. Well might Alfonso now recall the words Louis XII had uttered to the effect that, on the death of Alexander, he would not know who the lady was whom he had married. The king one day asked the Ferrarese plenipotentiary at his court how Madonna Lucretia had taken the Pope's death. When the ambassador replied that he did not know, Louis remarked, "I know that you were never satisfied with this marriage. This Madonna Lucretia is not Don Alfonso's real wife." Lucretia would have been frightened had she read a letter which Ercole wrote to Gian Giorgio Seregni, then his ambassador in Milan, which at that time was under French control, and in which he disclosed his real feelings on the Pope's demise. Gian Giorgio, knowing that many will ask you how we are affected by the Pope's death, this is to inform you that he was in no way displeasing to us. At one time we wished, for the honor of God, our Master, and for the general good of Christendom, that God in his goodness and foresight would provide a worthy shepherd, and that his church would be relieved of this great scandal. Personally, we had nothing to wish for. We were concerned chiefly with the honor of God and the general welfare. We may add, however, that there was never a pope from whom we received fewer favors than from this one, and this even after concluding an alliance with him. It was only the greatest difficulty that we secured from him what he had promised, but beyond this he never did anything for us. For this we hold the Duke of Romagna responsible, for although he could not do with us as he wished, he treated us as if we were perfect strangers. He was never frank with us. He never confided his plans to us, although we always informed him of ours. Finally, as he inclined to Spain, and we remained good Frenchmen, we had little to look for either from the Pope or his Majesty. Therefore his death caused us little grief, as we had nothing but evil to expect from the advancement of the above-named Duke. We want you to give this, our confidential statement to Chaumont, word for word, as we do not wish to conceal our true feelings from him, but speak cautiously to others about the subject, and then return this letter to our worthy counselor, Gianluca. Bel Riguardo, August 24th, 1503. This statement was very candid. In view of the advantages which had accrued to Ercole's state through the marriage with Lucretia, he might be regarded as ungrateful. He had, however, never looked upon this alliance as anything more than a business transaction, and so far as his relations with Caesar were concerned, his view was entirely correct. Let us now hear what another famous prince, one who was in the confidence of the Borgias, says regarding the Pope's death. At the time of this occurrence, the Marquis of Mantua was at his headquarters with a French army in Isola Farnese, a few miles from Rome. From there, September 22nd, 1503, he wrote his consort, Isabella, as follows. Illustrious Lady and dearest wife, in order that your Majesty may be familiar with the circumstances attending the Pope's death, we send you the following particulars. When he fell sick, he began to talk in such a way that anyone who did not know what was in his mind would have thought that he was wandering, although he was perfectly conscious of what he said. His words were, quote, "I come, it is right, wait a moment." Those who know the secret say that in the conclave following the death of Innocent he made a compact with the devil, and purchased the papacy from him at the price of his soul. Among the other provisions of the agreement was one which said that he should be allowed to occupy the Holy See 12 years, and this he did with the addition of 4 days. There are some who affirm that at the moment he gave up his spirit, 7 devils were seen in his chamber. As soon as he was dead, his body began to putrefy, and his mouth to foam like a kettle over the fire, which continued as long as it was on earth. The body swelled up so that it lost all human form. It was nearly as broad as it was long. It was carried to the grave with little ceremony. A porter dragged it from the bed by means of a cord fastened to the foot to the place where it was buried, as all refused to touch it. It was given a wretched interment, in comparison with which that of the cripple's dwarf wife in Mantua was ceremonious. Scandalous epigrams are every day published regarding him. The reports of Bouchard, of the Venetian ambassador Justinian, of the Ferrarese envoy Beltrando, and of numerous others described Alexander's end in almost precisely the same way, and the fable of the devil, or, quote, babuino, that carried Alexander's soul off, is also found in Marino Sanuto's diary. The highly educated Marquis of Gonzaga, with a simplicity equal to that of the people of Rome, believed it. The Mephisto legend of Faust and Don Juan, which was immediately associated with Alexander's death, even the black dog running about excitedly in St. Peter's is included, shows what was the opinion of Alexander's contemporaries regarding the terrible life of the Borgia and the extraordinary success which followed him all his days. Alexander's moral character is, however, so incomprehensible that even the keenest psychologists have failed to fathom it. In him neither ambition nor the desire for power, which in the majority of rulers is the motive of their crimes, was the cause of his evil deeds. Nor was it hate of his fellows, nor cruelty, nor yet a vicious pleasure in doing evil. It was, however, his sensuality, and also his love for his children, one of the noblest of human sentiments. All psychological theory would lead us to expect that the weight of his sins would have made Alexander a gloomy man with reason clouded by fear and madness, like Tiberius or Louis XI. But instead of this, we have ever before us the cheerful, active man of the world, even until his last years. Quote, "Nothing worries him. He seems to grow younger every day," wrote the Venetian ambassador scarcely 2 years before his death. It is not his passions or his crimes that are incomprehensible, for similar and even greater crimes have been committed by other princes, both before and after him, but it is the fact that he committed them while he was pope. How could Alexander VI reconcile his sensuality and his cruelty with the consciousness that he was the high priest of the Church, God's representative on earth? There are abysses in the human soul to the depths of which no glance can penetrate. How did he overcome the warnings, the qualms of conscience, and how was it possible for him constantly to conceal them under a joyous exterior? Could he believe in the immortality of the soul and the existence of a divine being? When we consider the utter abandon with which Alexander committed his crimes, we are forced to conclude that he was an atheist and a materialist. There is a time in the life of every philosophic and unhappy soul when all human endeavor seems nothing more than the despairing, purposeless activity of an aggregation of puppets. But in Alexander VI, we discover no trace of a Faust, nothing of his supreme contempt of the world, of his titanic skepticism, but we find, on the contrary, that he possessed an amazingly simple faith, coupled with a capacity for every crime. The Pope who had Christ's mother painted with the features of the adulteress Julia Farnese believed that he himself enjoyed the special protection of the Virgin. Alexander's life is the very antithesis of the Christian ideal. To be convinced of this, it is only necessary to compare the Pope's deeds with the teachings of the Gospel. Compare his actions with the commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear false witness. The fact that Rodrigo Borgia was a pope must seem to all the members of the Church the most unholy thing connected with it, and one which they have reason bitterly to regret. This fact, however, can never lessen the dignity of the Church, the greatest production of the human mind, But does it not destroy a number of transcendental theories which have been associated with the papacy? The execrations which all Italy directed against Alexander could scarcely have reached Lucretia's ears, but she doubtless anticipated them. Her distress must have been great. Her entire life in Rome returned and overwhelmed her. Her father had been the cause, first, of all her unhappiness, and subsequently of all her good fortune. Filial affection and religious fears must have assailed her at one and the same time. Bembo describes her suffering. This man, subsequently so famous, came to Ferrara in 1503, a young Venetian nobleman of the highest culture and fairest presence. He was warmly received by Lucretia, for whom he conceived great admiration. The accomplished cavalier wrote her the following letter of condolence. I called upon your Majesty yesterday, partly for the purpose of telling you how great was my grief on account of your loss, and partly to endeavor to console you, and to urge you to compose yourself, for I knew that you were suffering a measureless sorrow. I was able to do neither the one nor the other, for as soon as I saw you in that dark room, in your black gown, lying weeping, I was so overcome by my feelings that I stood still, unable to speak, not knowing what to say. Instead of giving sympathy, I myself was in need of it. Therefore I departed, completely overcome by the sad sight, mumbling and speechless, as you noticed or might have noticed. Perhaps this happened to me because you had need of neither my sympathy nor my condolences, for knowing my devotion and fidelity, you would also be aware of the pain which I felt on account of your sorrow, and you in your wisdom may find consolation within and not look to others for it. The best way to convey to you an idea of my grief is for me to say that fate could cause me no greater sorrow than by afflicting you. No other shot could so deeply penetrate my soul as one accompanied by your tears. Regarding condolence, I can only say to you, as you yourself must have thought, that time soothes and lessens all our griefs. So high is my opinion of your intelligence, and so numerous the proofs of your strength of character, that I know that you will find consolation, and will not grieve too long. For, although you have now lost your father, who was so great that fortune herself could not have given you a greater one, this is not the first blow which you have received from an evil and hostile destiny. You have suffered so much before that your soul must now be inured to misfortune. Present circumstances, moreover, require that you should not give anyone cause to think that you grieve less on account of the shock than you do on account of any anxiety as to your future position. It is foolish for me to write this to you. Therefore I will close, commending myself to you in all humility. Farewell. In Ostellato, August 22nd, 1503. End of Chapter 5. Section 28 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 6, Events Following the Pope's Death. After Lucretia's first transports had passed, she may well have blessed her good fortune, for to what danger would she have been exposed if she now, instead of being Alfonso's wife, was still forced to share the destiny of the Borgias? She was soon able to convince herself that her position in Ferrara was unshaken. She owed this to her own personality and to the permanent advantages which she had brought to the house of Este. She saw, however, that the lives of her kinsmen in Rome were in danger. There were her sick brother, her child Rodrigo, and Giovanni, Duke of Nepi, while the Orsini, burning with a desire to wipe out old scores, were hastening thither to avenge themselves for the blood of their kinsmen. She besought her father-in-law to help Caesar and to preserve his estates for him. Ercole thought it would be more to his own advantage for Caesar to hold the Romagna than to have it fall under the hands of Venice. He therefore sent Pandolfo Colonuccio thither to urge the people to remain true to their lord. To his ambassador in Rome he confided his joy that Caesar was on the road to recovery. With the exception of the Romagna, the empire of Alexander's son at once began to crumble away. The tyrants he had expelled returned to their cities. Guidobaldo and Elisabetta hastened from Venice to Urbino and were received with open arms. Still more promptly, Giovanni Sforza had returned from Mantua to Pesaro. The Marquis Gonzaga had sent him the first news of Alexander's death and of Caesar's illness, and Sforza thanked him in the following letter. Illustrious Sir and Honored Brother, I thank Your Excellency for the good news which you have given me in your letter, especially regarding the condition of Valentino. My joy is great because I believe my misfortunes are now at an end. I assure you that if I return to my country, I shall regard myself as Your Excellency's creature, and you may dispose of my person and my property as you will. I ask you, in case you learn anything more regarding Valentino, and especially of his death, that you will send me the news, for by doing so you will afford me great joy. I commend myself to you at all times. Mantua, August 25th, 1503. As early as September 3rd, Sforza was able to inform the Marquis that he had entered Pesaro amid the acclamations of the people. He immediately had a medal struck in commemoration of the happy event. On one side is his bust, and on the other a broken yoke with the words Patria Recepta. Filled with a desire for revenge, he punished the rebels of Pesaro by confiscating their property, casting them into prison, or by putting them to death. He had a number of the burghers hanged at the windows of his castle. Even Colonuccio, who had placed himself under the protection of Lucretia and the Duke in Ferrara, was soon to fall into his hands. With flattering promises, Giovanni induced him to come to Pesaro, and then on the ground of the complaint he had addressed to Caesar Borgia, which Sforza claimed he had only just discovered, he cast him into prison. Colonuccio, not wholly guiltless as far as his former master and friend was concerned, resigned himself to his fate and died in July 1504. Meanwhile, Lucretia was anxiously following the course of events in Rome. None of her letters to Caesar written at this time are preserved, nor are any of Caesar's to her. The only ones we have are those which he exchanged with the Duke of Ferrara, who continue to write him. September 13th, Ercole wrote congratulating him on his recovery and informing him that he had sent a messenger to the people of Romagna urging them to remain true to him. Caesar was in Nepi when he received this letter, having gone there September 2nd after he had arranged with a French ambassador in Rome, on the suggestion of the cardinal, to place himself under the protection of France. He was accompanied by his mother Venozza, his brother Giuffre, and doubtless also by his little daughter Luisa and the two children, Rodrigo and Giovanni, the latter of whom was Duke of Nepi. There he was safe, as the French army was camped in the neighborhood. Just as if nothing had happened, he wrote letters to the Marquis Gonzaga, who was then at his headquarters in Campagnano. He even sent him some hunting dogs as a present. There is also in existence a letter written by Giuffre to the same Gonzaga, dated Nepi, September 18th. While here, Caesar learned that his protector and friend Amboise had not been elected pope as he had hoped, but that Piccolomini had been chosen. September 22nd, this cardinal, senile and moribund, ascended the papal throne, assuming the name Pius III. He was the happy father of no less than 12 children, boys and girls, who would have been brought up in the Vatican as princes but for his early death. He permitted Caesar to return to Rome and even showed him some favor, but scarcely had the Borgia appeared, October 3rd, when the Orsini rose in their wrath and clamored for the death of their enemy. He and the two children took refuge in Castle Sant'Angelo, and October 18th, Piccolomini died. The two children now had no protector but Caesar and the cardinals, whom Alexander had appointed as their guardians. On the death of the Pope, their duchies crumbled away. The Gaetani returned from Mantua and again took possession of Sermoneta and all the other estates which had been bestowed upon the little Rodrigo. Ascanio Sforza demanded either Nepi or the position of chamberlain, and the last Varano again secured Camerino. Rodrigo was Duke of Pizelli, and as such under the protection of Spain, Alexander having succeeded in obtaining, May 20th, 1502, from Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile, a diploma by virtue of which the royal house of Spain confirmed the Borgia family in the possession of all their Neapolitan estates. In this act, Caesar and his heirs, Don Giuffre of Squillace, Don Juan, son of the murdered Gandia, Lucretia as Duchess of Pizelli, and her son and heir Rodrigo, are explicitly named. There is likewise in the Este archives an instrument which was drawn up in Lucretia's chancellery, referring to the control of Rodrigo's property, and also others regarding the little Giovanni. The two children, Rodrigo and Giovanni, during their early years were reared together. Lucretia provided for them from Ferrara, as is shown by the record of her household expenses in 1502 and 1503. There are numerous entries for velvet and silk and gold brocade, which she bought for the purpose of clothing the children. In spite of the protection of Spain, Lucretia's son's life was in danger in Rome, and it was her duty to have the child brought to her. But this she neglected to do, either because she did not dare do so, or she was not strong enough to bring it about, or because she perhaps feared that the child would be still in greater danger in Ferrara. The Cardinal of Cosenza, Rodrigo's guardian, suggested to her that she sell all his personal property and send him to Spain, where he would be safe. In a letter she informed her father-in-law of this, and he replied as follows: "Illustrious Lady, our dearest daughter-in-law and daughter, we have received your Majesty's letter, and also the one which His Eminence the Cardinal of Cosenza addressed to you, and which you sent us. This we return to you with our letter. No one but ourselves read it. We note the unanimity with which your Majesty and the Cardinal write. His advice shows such solicitude that it is at once apparent that it is due to his affection and wisdom. We have considered everything carefully, and it seems to us that your Majesty can and ought to do what the worthy Monseigneur suggests. In fact, I think your Majesty is bound to do as he advises on account of the affection which he displays for you and the illustrious Don Rodrigo, your son, who, I am told, owes his life to the Cardinal. Although Don Rodrigo will be at a distance from you, it is better for him to be away and safe than for him to be near and in danger, as the Cardinal thinks he would be. Your mutual love would in no way suffer by this separation. When he grows up, he can decide, according to the circumstances, whether it is best for him to return to Italy or remain away. The Cardinal's suggestion to convert his personal property into money, to provide for his support and to increase his income, as he states he is anxious to do, is a good idea. In brief, as we have said, it seems to us that you had best consent. Nevertheless, if your Majesty, who is perfectly competent to decide this, determine otherwise, we are perfectly willing. Farewell, Hercules, Duke of Ferrara, etc. Corigorio, October 4th, 1503. In the meantime, November 1st, 1503, Della Rovere ascended the papal throne as Julius II. The Rovere, the Borgias, and the Medici each gave the Church two popes, and they impressed upon the papacy the political form of the modern state. In the entire annals of the Church, there are no other families which have so deeply affected the course of history. Their names suggest innumerable political and moral revolutions. Della Rovere now released Caesar, whose bitterest enemy he had once been. It was apparent that Valentino's destruction was imminent. Elsewhere, we may read how Julius II first used Caesar for the purpose of assuring his election by means of his influence on the Spanish cardinals, and how he subsequently, after the surrender of the fortresses in the Romagna, cast him aside. Caesar threw himself into the arms of Spain, going from Ostia to Naples in October 1504, where the great Captain Gonsalvo represented Ferdinand the Catholic. Don Ciuffre accompanied him. Cardinals Francesco Remolini of Sorrento and Ludovico Borgia had preceded him to Naples to escape a prosecution with which they were threatened. There Gonsalvo broke the safe conduct which he had given Caesar. May 27th he seized him in the name of King Ferdinand and confined him in the castle of Ischia. We hear nothing of the fate of the Borgia children. Apparently they remained under the protection of the Spanish cardinals in Rome or Naples. Caesar, saving nothing and barely escaping with his life, set out for Spain. He had previously placed his valuables in the hands of his friends in Rome to keep for him or send to Ferrara. December 31st, 1503, Duke Ercole wrote his ambassador in Rome to take charge of Caesar's chests when the Cardinal of Sorrento should send them to him, and forward them to Ferrara as the property of the Cardinal d'Este. Cardinal Remolini died in May 1507, and Julius II confiscated in his house 12 chests and 84 bales, which contained tapestry, rich stuffs, and other property belonging to Caesar. The Pope ordered the Florentines to return certain other property of Caesar's, consisting of gold, silver, and similar valuables which he had sent to their city. The Florentine Signory, however, stated that they would have nothing to do with the matter. The removal of Caesar to Spain caused great excitement. No one, neither Gonsalvo, the Pope, nor King Ferdinand, was willing to assume the responsibility for it. It was even stated that it was due to Gandia's widow, who was at the Castilian court endeavoring to secure the arrest of her husband's murderer. The Spanish cardinals and Lucretia exerted themselves to obtain Caesar's release. The first news of him came from Spain in October 1504. Costabile wrote to Ferrara, quote, "The affairs of the Duke of Valentino do not appear to be in such a desperate condition as has been represented, for the Cardinal of Salerno has a letter of the 3rd instant from Requesens, the Duke's majordomo, which His Majesty's despatched before he reached there, and letters from several cardinals to His Majesty of Spain. Requesens writes that the Duke was confined with one servant in the castle of Seville, which, although very strong, is roomy. He was soon furnished with 8 servants. He also writes that he has spoken to the king regarding freeing Caesar, and that His Majesty stated that he had not ordered the Duke's confinement, but had given instructions for him to be brought to Spain, on account of certain charges which Gonsalvo had made against him. If these were found to be untrue, he would do as the cardinal requested concerning Caesar. However, nothing could be done until the queen recovered. He made the same answer to the ambassador of the King and Queen of Navarre, who endeavored to secure the Duke's release, and consequently Requesens hoped that he would soon be set free. From this letter of Requesens it appears that Caesar was first taken to Seville, and from there was sent to the castle of Medina del Campo in Castile. The King of France turned a deaf ear to his petitions. No one in Italy wanted him set free. His sister was the only person in the peninsula who took any interest in the overthrown upstart, and her appeals found little support among the Este. It was well known that if Caesar returned to Italy, he would only cause uneasiness at the court of Ferrara, and would in all probability make it the center of his intrigues. The Gonzaga alone appeared not to have entirely withdrawn their favor from him, although instead of wishing, as they once had done, to establish a matrimonial alliance with him, they now connected themselves with the Rovere, the Marquis of Mantua, marrying his young daughter Leonora to Julius's nephew Francesco Maria della Rovere, heir of Urbino, April 9, 1505. It was especially Isabella who, owing to her affection for her sister-in-law Lucretia, seconded her appeals to her husband. In the archives of the House of Gonzaga are several letters written by Lucretia to the Marquis in the interests of her brother. August 18, 1505, she wrote him from Reggio that she had taken steps in Rome to induce the Pope to permit Cardinal Petro Isuales to go to the Spanish court to endeavor to secure Caesar's freedom, and she hoped to succeed. She therefore asked the Marquis himself to request the Pope to allow the Cardinal to undertake this mission. She wrote to him again from Belriguardo, thanking him for his promise to dispatch an agent to Spain, and she sent him a letter for King Ferdinand and another for her brother. It is not known whether the cardinal actually undertook this journey to Madrid, but it is hardly likely that Julius would have allowed him to do so. End of Chapter 6. Section 29 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 7. Court Poets, Julia Bella and Julius II, the Este dynasty endangered. During the year when Lucretia, filled with a sister's love, was grieving over the fate of her terrible brother, a great change occurred in her own circumstances, she having become Duchess of Ferrara January 25, 1505. Her husband, Alfonso, in compliance with his father's wishes, had undertaken a journey to France, Flanders, and England for the purpose of him becoming acquainted with the courts of those countries. He was to return to Italy by way of Spain, but while he was at the court of Henry VII of England, he received despatches informing him that his father was sick. He hastened back to Ferrara, and Ercole died shortly after his return. Alfonso ascended the ducal throne at a time when a strong hand and high intelligence were required to save his state from the dangers which threatened it. The Republic of Venice had already secured possession of a part of Romagna and was planning to cut Ferrara off from the mouth of the Po. At the same time, Julius II was scheming to take Bologna, and if he succeeded in this, he would doubtless also attack Ferrara. In view of these circumstances, it was a fortunate thing for the state that its chief was a practical, cool-headed man like Alfonso. He was neither extravagant nor fond of display, and he cared nothing for a brilliant court. He was indifferent to externals, even to his own clothing. His chief concern was to increase the efficiency of the army, build fortresses, and cast cannon. When the affairs of state left him any leisure, he amused himself at a turning lathe which he had set up, and also in painting maiolica vases, in which art he was exceedingly skilful. He had no inclination for the higher culture. This he left to his wife. The small collection of books which Lucretia brought with her from Rome shows that she possessed some education and an inclination to take part in the intellectual movement of Ferrara. We have a catalogue of these books, of the years 1502 and 1503, which shows what were Lucretia's tastes. According to this list, she possessed a number of books, many of which were beautifully bound in purple velvet, with gold and silver mountings, a breviary, a book with the 7 Psalms and other prayers, a parchment with miniatures in gold called De Copule alla Spagnola, the printed letters of St. Catherine of Siena, the epistles and gospels in the vulgar tongue, a religious work in Castilian, a manuscript collection of Spanish canzone with the proverbs of Domenico Lopez, a printed work entitled Aquila Volante, another called Supplement of Chronicles in the vulgar tongue, the Mirror of Faith in Italian, a printed copy of Dante with a commentary, a work in Italian on philosophy, the Legend of the Saints in the vulgar tongue, an old work, De Ventura, a Donatus, a Life of Christ in Spanish, a manuscript of Petrarch on parchment in duodecimo. From this catalogue, it is evident that Lucretia's studies were not very profound. Her books were confined to religious works and belles lettres. Lucretia established her ducal court in accordance with the dictates of her own fancy. She was now the soul and center of the intellectual life of Ferrara. Her cultivated intellect, her beauty, and the irresistible joyousness of her being charmed all who came into her presence. The opposition which the members of the House of Este at first had shown her had disappeared, and especially in the case of Isabella Gonzaga had changed into affection, as is proved by the extensive correspondence which the two women maintained up to the time of Lucretia's death. In the archives of the House of Gonzaga there are several hundred of her letters to the Marchesa of Mantua. Her relations with the House of Urbino were no less pleasant, and they continued so even after the death of Guidobaldo in April 1508, for his successor was Francesco Maria della Rovere, son-in-law of Isabella Gonzaga. She was frequently visited by these princes, and she enjoyed the friendship of a number of remarkable men, Baldassare Castiglione, Ottaviano Fregoso, Aldus Manutius, and Bembo. Bembo, who was in love with the beautiful Duchess, constantly sang her praises, and August 1st, 1504, he dedicated to her his dialogue on love, the Asolani, in a letter in which he celebrated her virtues. His friend Aldo first spent some time in Ferrara at the court of Ercole, and subsequently went to the Pio at Carpi. Finally he settled in Venice, where he printed the Asolani in the year 1505 and dedicated it to Lucretia. There is no doubt about Bembo's passion for the Duchess, but it would be a fruitless undertaking to endeavor to prove, from the evidences of affection which the beautiful woman bestowed upon him, that it passed the bounds of propriety. The belief that it did is due to the letters which Bembo wrote her, and which are printed in his works, and still more to those which Lucretia addressed to him. From 1503 to 1506, in which year he removed to the court of Guidobaldo, the intellectual Venetian enjoyed the closest friendship with Lucretia. He corresponded with her while he was living with his friends the Strozzi in Villa Ostellato. These letters, especially those addressed to an, quote, anonymous friend, by which designation he clearly meant Lucretia, are inspired by friendship and display a tender confidence. Lucretia's letters to Bembo are preserved in the Ambrosiana in Milan, where they and the lock of blonde hair near them are examined by everyone who visits the famous library. The letters are written in her own hand, and there is no doubt of their authenticity. Concerning the lock of hair, there is some uncertainty, Still, it may be one of the pledges of affection which the happy Bembo carried away with him. Lucretia's letters to Bembo were first examined and described by Baldassare Oltrocchi and subsequently by Lord Byron. In 1859 they were published in Milan by Bernardo Gatti. There are 9 in all, 7 in Italian and 2 in Spanish. They are accompanied by a Castilian canzone. It seems certain that she felt more than mere friendship for Bembo, for she was young and he was an accomplished cavalier, fair, amiable, and witty, who cast the rough Alfonso completely in the shade. He excited the latter's jealousy, and the danger which threatened him may have been the cause of his removal to Urbino. Lucretia kept up her friendly relations with him until the year 1513. Several other poets in Ferrara devoted their talents to her glorification. The verses which the 2 Strozzi addressed to her are even more ardent than those of Bembo, perhaps because their authors possessed greater poetical talent. Tito, the father, experienced the same feelings for the beautiful Duchess as did his genial son Ercole, and he expressed them in the same poetical forms and imagery. This very similarity indicates that their devotion was merely aesthetic. Tito sang of a rose which Lucretia had sent him, but his son excelled him in an epigram on the Rose of Lucretia, which could hardly have been the same one his father had received. Tito, in his epigram, described himself as senescent and consequently not likely to be wounded by Cupid's darts, but he, nevertheless, was ensnared by Lucretia's charms. In her, so he says, all the majesty of heaven and earth are personified, and her like is not to be found on earth. He addressed an epigram to Bembo, with whose passion for Lucretia he was acquainted, in which he derives the name Lucretia from, quote, lux and, quote, retia, and makes merry over the net in which Bembo was caught. His son Ercole describes her as a Juno in good works, a Pallas in decorum, and a Venus in beauty. In verses in imitation of Catullus, he sang of the marble Cupid, which the Duchess had set up in her salon, saying that the god of love had been turned into stone by her glance. He compared Lucretia's beautiful eyes with the sun, that blinds whosoever ventures to look at it. Like Medusa, whose glance turned the beholder to stone, yet in this case, quote, the pains of love still continued immortalized in the stone. Is it possible to believe that these poets would have written such verses if they had considered Lucretia Borgia guilty of the crimes which, even after her father's death, had been ascribed to her by Sanazzaro? Antonio Tabaldeo, Calcianini, and Giraldi sang of Lucretia's beauty and virtue. Marcel Filoseno dedicated a number of charming sonnets to her, in which he compared her with Minerva and Venus. Jacopo Caviccio, who in the last years of his life, he died in 1511, was vicar of the bishopric of Ferrara, dedicated to her his wonderful romance Peregrino, with an inscription in which he describes her as beautiful, learned, wise, and modest. The number of poets who threw themselves at her feet was certainly large, and she doubtless received their flattery with the same satisfied vanity with which a beautiful woman of today would accept such offerings. Some of these poets may really have been in love with her, while others burned their incense as court flatterers. All, doubtless, were glad to find in her an ideal to serve as a platonic inspiration for their rhymes and verses. Ariosto excepted, these poets are to us nothing more than names in the history of literature. The great poet's relations with the princely house of Ferrara began about 1503, when he entered the service of Cardinal Ippolito. Soon after this, in the year 1505, he began his great epic, and the beautiful Duchess appears to have had very little influence on his work. He refers to her occasionally, especially in a stanza for which she owed the poet little thanks if she foresaw his immortality, the 83rd stanza in the 42nd canto of the Orlando Furioso, in which he places Lucretia's portrait in the temple to woman. The inscription under her portrait says that her fatherland, Rome, on account of her beauty and modesty, must regard her as excelling Lucretia of old. A recent Italian writer, speaking of Ariosto's adulation, says, quote, however much of it may be looked upon as court flattery, and as due the poet's obligations to the house of Este, we know that the art of flattery had also its laws and bounds, and that one who ascribed such qualities to a prince who was known to be entirely lacking in them would be regarded as little acquainted with the world and with court manners, for he would cause the person to be publicly ridiculed. In this case, the praise would degenerate into satire, and the incautious flatterer would fare badly. Flattery has always been the return which court poets make for their slavery. Ariosto and Tasso were no more free from it than were Horace and Virgil. When the poet of the Orlando Furioso discovered that Cardinal Ippolito was beginning to treat him coldly, he thought to strike out everything he had said in his praise. Although it was probably merely the name Lucretia which Ariosto and other poets used, comparing it with the classic ideal of feminine honor, it is nevertheless difficult wholly to reject the interpretation of Lucretia's modern advocates, for, even when this comparison was not made, other admirers, Ariosto especially, praised the beautiful Duchess for her decorum. This much is certain: her life in Ferrara was regarded as a model of feminine virtue. There was a young woman in her household who charmed all who came in contact with her until she became the cause of a tragedy at the court. This was the Angela Borgia whom Lucretia had brought with her from Rome, and who had been affianced to Francesco Maria Rovere. It is not known when the betrothal was set aside, although it may have been shortly after Alexander's death. The heir of Urbino married, as has been stated, Eleonore Gonzaga. Among Angela's admirers were two of Alfonso's brothers, who were equally depraved, Cardinal Ippolito and Giulio, a natural son of Ercole. One day, when Ippolito was assuring Angela of his devotion, she began to praise the beauty of Giulio's eyes, which so enraged his utterly degenerate rival that he planned a horrible revenge. The cardinal hired assassins and commanded them to seize his brother when he was returning from the hunt, and to tear out the eyes which Donna Angela had found so beautiful. The attempt was made in the presence of the cardinal, but it did not succeed as completely as he had wished. The wounded man was carried to his palace, where the physicians succeeded in saving one of his eyes. This crime, which occurred November 3rd, 1505, aroused the whole court. The unfortunate Giulio demanded that it be paid in kind, but the duke merely banished the cardinal. The injured man brooded on revenge, and the direst consequences followed. Ariosto, the wicked cardinal's courtier, fell into difficulties from which he escaped in a way not altogether honorable, which lessens the worth of the praise he bestowed upon Lucretia. He wrote a poem in which he endeavored to clear the murderer by blackening Giulio's character and concealing the motive for the crime. In the same eclogue he poured forth the most ardent praise of Lucretia. He lauded not only her beauty, her good works, her intellect, but above all her modesty, for which she was famous before coming to Ferrara. A year later, December 6, 1506, Lucretia married Donna Angela to Count Alessandro Pio of Sassuolo, and by a remarkable coincidence, her son Gilberto subsequently became the husband of Isabella, a natural daughter of Cardinal Ippolito. In November 1505, an event occurred in the Vatican which aroused great interest on the part of Lucretia and likewise caused her most painful memories. Giulia Farnese, the companion of her unhappy youth, made her appearance there under circumstances which must have overcome her. We know nothing of the life of Alexander's mistress during the years immediately preceding and following his death. She and her husband Orsini were living in Castle Basanello, to which her mother Adriano had also removed. At least Giulia was there in 1504, about which time one of the Orsini committed one of those crimes with which the history of the great families of Italy is filled. Her sister, Girolama Farnese, widow of Puccio Pucci, had entered into a second marriage, this time with Count Giuliano Orsini of Anguillara, and had been murdered by her stepson, Giambattista of Stabia, because, as it was alleged, she had tried to poison him. Giulia buried her deceased sister in 1504 at Basanello. She must have gone to Rome the following year and taken up her abode in the Orsini palace. Her husband was not living, and Adriana may also have been dead, for she was not present at the ceremony in the Vatican in November 1505, when Giulia, to the great astonishment of all Rome, married her only daughter, Laura, to the nephew of the Pope, Niccolò Rovere, brother of Cardinal Galeotto. Laura passed among all those who were acquainted with her mother's secret as the child of Alexander VI and natural sister of the Duchess of Ferrara. When she was only 7 years old, her mother had betrothed her to Federico, the 12-year-old son of Raimondo Farnese. This was April 2nd, 1499. This alliance was subsequently dissolved to enable her to enter into a union as brilliant as her heart could possibly desire. The consent of Julius II to the betrothal of his nephew with the bastard daughter of Alexander VI is one of the most astonishing facts in the life of this pope. It perhaps marks his reconciliation with the Borgia. He had hated the men of this family while he was hostile to them, but his hatred was not due to any moral feelings. Julius II felt no contempt for Alexander and Caesar, but, on the other hand, it is more likely that he marveled at their strength, as did Machiavelli. We do not know that he had any personal relations with Lucretia Borgia after he ascended the papal throne, although this certainly would have been probable owing to the position of the House of Este. On one occasion he deeply offended Lucretia when, in reinstating Guglielmo Gaetani in possession of Sermoneta by a bull dated January 24, 1504, he applied the most uncomplimentary epithets to Alexander VI, describing him as a, quote, swindler who had enriched his own children by plundering others. This especially concerned Lucretia, for she had been mistress of Sermoneta, which had subsequently been given to her son Rodrigo. Later, after Alfonso ascended the ducal throne, the relations between the Pope and Lucretia must have become more friendly. She kept up a lively correspondence with Giulia Farnese and doubtless received from her the news of the betrothal of her daughter to a member of the Pope's family. The betrothal took place in the Vatican, in the presence of Julius II, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, and the mother of the young bride. This was one of the greatest triumphs of Giulia's romantic life. She had overcome the opposition of another pope, and one who had been the enemy of Alexander VI and the man who had ruined Caesar. She, the adulteress, who had been branded by the satirists of Rome and all of Italy as mistress of Alexander VI, now appeared in the Vatican as one of the most respectable women of the Roman aristocracy, quote, the illustrious Donna Giulia de Farnesio, Orsini's widow, for the purpose of betrothing the daughter of Alexander and herself to the Pope's nephew, thereby receiving absolution for the sins of her youth. She was still a beautiful and fascinating woman, and at most not more than 30 years of age. This good fortune and the rehabilitation of her character, if in view of the morals of the time we may so describe it, she owed to the intercession of her brother the cardinal. Political considerations likewise induced the Pope to consent to the alliance, for in order to carry out his plan for extending the pontifical states, it was necessary for him to win over the great families of Rome. He secured the support of the Farnese and of the Orsini. In May 1506, he married his own natural daughter Felice to Gian Giordano Orsini of Bracciano, and in July of the same year he gave his niece Lucretia Gara Rovere, sister of Niccolò, to Marcantonio Colonna as his wife. Again Giulia Farnese vanished from sight, and neither under Julius II nor Leo X does she reappear. March 14, 1524, she made a will which was to be in favor of her nieces Isabella and Costanza in case her daughter should die without issue. March 23, the Venetian ambassador in Rome, Marco Foscari, informed his signory that Cardinal Farnese's sister, Madama Giulia, formerly mistress of Pope Alexander VI, was dead. From this we are led to assume that she died in Rome. No authentic likeness of Giulia Bella has come down to us, but tradition says that one of the two reclining marble figures which adorn the monument of Paul III Farnese in St. Peter's, Justice, represents his sister Giulia Farnese, while the other, Wisdom, is the likeness of his mother, Giovanella Gaetani. Giulia's daughter was mistress of Basanello and Carboniano. She had one son, Giulio della Rovere, who subsequently became famous as a scholar. In the meantime, the attempt against Giulio d'Este had been attended by such consequences that the princely house of Ferrara found itself confronted by a grave danger. Giulio complained to Alfonso of injustice, while the cardinal's numerous friends considered his banishment too severe a punishment. Ippolito had a great following in Ferrara. he was a lavish man of the world, while the Duke, owing to his utilitarian ways and practical life, repelled the nobility. A party was formed which advocated a revolution. The House of Este had survived many of these attempts. One had occurred when Ercole ascended the throne. Giulio succeeded in winning over to his cause certain disaffected nobles and conscienceless men who were in the service of the Duke. Among them, Count Albertino Boschetti of San Cesario, his son-in-law, the captain of the palace guard, a chamberlain, one of the Duke's minstrels, and a few others. Even Don Ferrante, Alfonso's own brother, who had been his proxy when he married Lucretia in Rome, entered into the conspiracy. The plan was first to dispatch the cardinal with poison, and, as this act would be punished if the Duke were allowed to live, he was to be destroyed at a masked ball, and Don Ferrante was to be placed on the throne. The cardinal, who was well served by his spies in Ferrara, received news of what was going on and immediately informed his brother Alfonso. This was in July 1506. The conspirators sought safety in flight, but only Giulio and the minstrel Guasconi succeeded in escaping, the former to Mantua and the latter to Rome. Count Boschetti was captured in the vicinity of Ferrara. Don Ferrante apparently made no effort to escape. When he was brought before the Duke, he threw himself at his feet and begged for mercy. But Alfonso, in his wrath, lost control of himself, and not only cast him from him, but struck out one of his eyes with a staff which he had in his hand. He had him confined in the tower of the castle, whither Don Giulio, whom the Marchese of Mantua had delivered after a short resistance, was soon brought. The trial for treason was quickly ended, and sentence of death passed upon the guilty. First Boschetti and 2 of his companions were beheaded in front of the Palazzo della Ragione. This scene is faithfully described in a contemporaneous Ferrarese manuscript on criminology, now preserved in the library of the university. The 2 princes were to be executed in the court of the castle, August 12th. The scaffold was erected, the tribunes were filled, the Duke took his place, and the unfortunate wretches were led to the block. Alfonso made a signal. He was about to show mercy to his brothers. They lost consciousness and were carried back to prison. Their punishment had been commuted to life imprisonment. They spent years in captivity, surviving Alfonso himself. Apparently it caused him no contrition to know that his miserable brothers were confined in the castle where he dwelt and held his festivities. Such were the Este, whom Ariosto in his poem lauded to the skies. Not until February 22nd, 1540, did death release Don Ferrante, then in the 63rd year of his age. Don Giulio was granted his freedom in 1559 and died March 24th, 1561, age 83. End of Chapter 7. Section 30 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 8, Escape and Death of Caesar. It was at the time of this great tragedy in Ferrara, which must have vividly reminded Lucretia of her own experiences in the papal city, that Julius II left Rome for the purpose of carrying out his bold plans for re-establishing the pontifical states by driving out the tyrants who had succeeded in escaping Caesar's sword. Alfonso, as a vassal of the Church, sent him some troops, but he did not take part personally in the expedition. Guidobaldo of Urbino, who had adopted Francesco Maria Rovere as his son and heir, and the Marchese Gonzaga served in the army of Julius II. September 12, 1506, the Pope entered Perugia, whose tyrants, the Baglioni, surrendered. November 11th, he made his entry into Bologna, Giovanni Bentivoglio and his wife Ginevra having fled with their children. There Julius halted, casting longing looks at Romagna, formerly Caesar's domain, but now occupied by the Venetian army. It is a curious coincidence that it was at this very moment that the Duke of Romagna, who had vanished from the stage, again appeared. In November, Lucretia received news that her brother had escaped from his prison in Spain, and she immediately communicated the fact to the Marchese Gonzaga, who, as field marshal of the Church, was in Bologna. Lucretia had frequently exerted herself to secure Caesar's freedom, and had remained in constant communication with him by messenger. Her petitions, however, had produced no effect upon the King of Spain. Finally, owing to favorable circumstances, Caesar succeeded in effecting his escape. Zurita says that Ferdinand the Catholic intended to remove him from his prison in the spring of 1506 to Aragon, and then to take him to Naples, whither he was going to place the affairs of the kingdom in order and to assure himself of Gonzalvo, whose loyalty he suspected. His son-in-law, the Archduke Philip, with whom he was at variance on account of his pretensions to the kingdom of Castile, refused to allow Caesar to be released from Medina, a Castilian place. While Ferdinand was absent on his journey, Philip died at Burgos, September 5, 1506, and Caesar took advantage of this opportunity and the king's absence to escape. This he did with the help of the Castilian party, who hoped to profit by the services of the famous condottiere. October 25th, he escaped from the castle of Medina to the estates of the Count of Benevente, where he remained. Some of the barons who wished to place the government of Castile in the hands of Maximilian, Philip's father, were anxious to send him to Flanders as their messenger to the emperor's court. As this plan fell through, Caesar betook himself to Pamplona to his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre, who had become embroiled in this Castilian intrigue and was at war with his rebellious constable, the Count of Lerin. From that place Caesar wrote the Marchese of Mantua, and this is the last letter written by him which has been discovered. Illustrious Prince, I inform you that after innumerable disappointments it has pleased God, our Master, to free me and release me from prison. How this happened you will learn from my secretary Federigo, the bearer. May this, by God's never-failing mercy, redound to his great service. At present I am with the illustrious King and Queen of Navarre in Pamplona, where I arrived December 3rd, as your Majesty will learn from the above-named Federigo, who will also inform you of all that has occurred. You may believe whatever he tells you in my name, just as if I myself were speaking to you. I commend myself to your Excellency forever. From Pamplona, December 7th, 1506, your Majesty's friend and younger brother, Caesar. The letter has a wafer bearing the combined arms of Caesar, with the inscription Caesar Borgia de Francias Dux Romandioli. One shield has the Borgia arms, with the French lilies, and a helmet from which 7 snarling dragons issue. The other, the arms of Caesar's wife, with the lilies of France, and a winged horse rising from the casque. Caesar's secretary reached Ferrara the last day of December. This same Federigo had been in that city once before, during July of the year 1506, and had been sent back to Spain by the Duchess. He now returned to Italy, not for the purpose of bringing the news of his master's escape, but to learn how matters stood, and to ascertain whether there was any prospect of restoring the Duke of Romagna. His majordomo, Requesens, who was in Ferrara in January, had come for the same purpose. No time, however, could have been less favorable for such schemes than the year 1506, for Julius II had just taken possession of Bologna. The Marchese Gonzaga, upon whose goodwill Caesar still reckoned, was commander of the papal army, which it was believed was planning an expedition into the Romagna. This was the only country where there was the slightest possibility of Caesar succeeding in reacquiring his power, for his good government had left a favorable impression on the Romagnols, who would have preferred his authority to that of the Church. Zurita, the historian of Aragon, is correct when he says, quote, Caesar's escape caused the Pope great anxiety, for the Duke was a man who would not have hesitated to throw all Italy in turmoil for the purpose of carrying out his own plans. He was greatly beloved, not only by the men of war, but also by many people in Ferrara and in the states of the Church, something which seldom falls to the lot of a tyrant. Caesar's messenger ventured to Bologna in spite of the presence of the Pope, and there the latter had him seized. This was reported to Lucretia, who immediately wrote to the Marchese of Gonzaga as follows. Illustrious brother-in-law and honored brother, I have just learned that by command of His Holiness, our Federigo, the Chancellor of the Duke, my brother, has been seized in Bologna. I am sure he has done nothing to deserve this, for he did not come here with the intention of doing or saying anything that would displease or injure His Holiness. His Excellency would not countenance or risk anything of this sort against His Holiness. If Federigo had been given any order of this nature, he would have first informed me of it, and I should never have permitted him to give any ground for complaint, for I am a devoted and faithful servant of the Pope, as is also my illustrious husband. I know of no other reason for his coming than to inform us of the Duke's escape. Therefore I consider his innocence as beyond question. This apprehension of the courier is especially displeasing to me, because it will injure my brother, the Duke, making it appear that he is not in His Holiness's favour, and the same may be said of myself. I, therefore, urgently request your Excellency, of course if you are disposed to do me a favour, to use every means to induce His Holiness to release the messenger promptly, which I trust he will do out of his own goodness, and owing to the mediation of your Excellency. There is no way your Majesty could give me greater pleasure than by doing this, for the sake of my own honour and every other consideration, and in no way could I become more beholden to you. Therefore I commend myself again to you with all my heart. Your Majesty's sister and servant, the Duchess of Ferrara. Ferrara, January 15th, 1507. Caesar had sent his former majordomo, Don Jaime de Requesens, from Pamplona to the King of France, to ask him to allow him to return to his court and enter his service. To this, however, Louis XII would not listen. The messenger met with a severe rebuff when he demanded in Caesar's name the Duchy of Valentinois and the revenue which he had formerly enjoyed as a prince of the French house. Death soon put an end to the hopes of the famous adventurer. While in the service of his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre, he conducted the siege of the castle of Viana, which was defended by the king's vassal, Don Lois de Beaumont, Count of Lorraine. There he fell, bravely fighting, March 12, 1507. This place is situated in the diocese of Pamplona, and as Zurita remarks, Caesar's death, by a curious coincidence, occurred on the anniversary of the day on which to him had been given the bishopric of Pamplona. There he was interred with high honours. Like Nero, he was only 31 years of age at the time of his demise. The fall of this terrible man, before whom all Italy had once trembled, and whose name was celebrated far and wide, relieved Julius II of a pretender who in time might have been a hindrance to him. For Caesar, as an ally and a condottiere of Venice, would have spared no effort to force him into a war with the Republic for the possession of Romagna, or into a war with France on his withdrawal from the League of Cambrai, and the revengeful Louis XII would certainly have brought Caesar back to the Romagna for the purpose of availing himself both of his former connections in that country and also of his great talents as a soldier. The news of Caesar's death reached Ferrara while the Duke was absent in April 1507, by way of Rome and Naples. His counsellor Magnanini and Cardinal Ippolito withheld the news from the Duchess, who was near her confinement. She was merely told that her brother had been wounded in battle. Greatly distressed, she betook herself to one of the convents in the city, where she spent 2 days in prayer before returning to the castle. As soon as the talk regarding Caesar's death reached her ears, she despatched her servant Tullio for Navarre, but on the way he received a report of the burial and turned back to Ferrara. Grasica, one of Cassar's equerries, also came to Ferrara and gave a full report of the circumstances attending the death of his master, at whose interment in Pamplona he had been present. The cardinal, therefore, decided to tell Lucretia the truth, and gave her husband's letter containing the news of Caesar's death. The Duchess displayed more self-control than had been expected. Her sorrow was mingled with a bitter recollection of all she had experienced and suffered in Rome, the memory of which had been dulled, but not wholly obliterated by her life in Ferrara. Twice the murder of her young husband Alfonso must have come back to her in all its horror, once on the death of her father, and again on that of her terrible brother. If her grief was not inspired by the overwhelming memories of former times, the sight of Lucretia weeping for Caesar Borgia is a beautiful example of sisterly love, the purest and most noble of human sentiments. Valentino certainly did not appear to his sister or to his contemporaries in the form in which we now behold him, for his crimes seem blacker and blacker, while his good qualities and that which, following Machiavelli, we may call his political worth, are constantly diminishing. To every thinking man, the power which this young upstart, owing to an unusual combination of circumstances, acquired is merely a proof of what the timid, short-sighted generality of mankind will tolerate. They tolerated the immature greatness of Caesar Borgia, before whom princes and states trembled for years, and he was not the last bold but empty idol of history before whom the world has tottered. Although Lucretia may not have had a very clearly defined opinion of her brother, neither her memory nor her sight could have been wholly dulled. She herself forgave him, but she must, nevertheless, have asked herself whether the incorruptible Judge of all mankind would forgive him, for she was a devout and faithful Catholic according to the religious standards of the age. She doubtless had innumerable masses said for his soul, and assailed heaven with endless prayers. Ercole Strozzi sought to console her in pompous verse. In 1508 he dedicated to her his elegy on Caesar. This fantastic poem is remarkable as having been the production of this man, and it might be defined as the poetic counterpart of Machiavelli's Prince. First, the poet describes the deep sorrow of the two women, Lucretia and Charlotte, lamenting the deceased with burning tears, even as Cassandra and Polyxena bewailed the loss of Achilles. He depicts the triumphant progress of Caesar, who resembled the great Roman by his deeds as well as in name. He enumerated the various cities he had seized in Romagna and complained that an envious fate had not permitted him to subjugate more of them, for if it had, the fame of the capture of Bologna would not have fallen to Julius II. The poet says that the genius of Rome had once appeared to the people and foretold the fall of Alexander and Caesar, complaining that all hope of the savior of the line of Calixtus, whom the gods had promised, would expire with them. Aratus had told the poet of these promises made in Olympus, Pallas and Venus, one as the friend of Caesar in Spain, the other as the patron of Italy, unwilling that strangers should rule over the descendants of the Trojans, had complained to Jupiter of his failure to fulfill his promise to give Italy a great king who would be likewise her savior. Jupiter had reassured them by saying that fate was inexorable. Caesar, like Achilles, had to die, but from the two lines of Este and Borgia, which sprang from Troy and Greece, the promised hero would come. Pallas thereupon appeared in Nepi, where, after Alexander's death, Caesar lay sick of the pest, in his camp, and, in the form of his father, informed him of his approaching end, which he, conscious of his fame, must suffer like a hero. Then she disappeared in the form of a bird and hastened to Lucretia in Ferrara. After the poet described Caesar's fall in Spain, he sought to console the sister with philosophic platitudes, and then with the assurance that she was to be the mother of the child who was destined for such a great career. According to Zurita, Caesar left but one legitimate child, a daughter, who was living with her mother under the protection of the King of Navarre. Her name was Louisa. Later she married Louis de la Trémouille, and on his death Philippe of Bourbon, Baron of Boussay. Her mother, Charlotte d'Abreu, having suffered much in life, gave herself up to holy works. She retired from the world and died March 11, 1504. Two natural children of Caesar, a son Girolamo and a daughter Lucretia, were living in Ferrara, where the latter became a nun and died in 1573, she being at the time abbess of San Bernardino. As late as February 1550, an illegitimate son of Caesar's appeared in Paris. He was a priest, and he announced that he was the natural son of the Duke of Romagna, and called himself Don Luigi. He had come from Rome to ask assistance of the King of France, because, as he said, his father had met his death while he was in the service of the French crown in the kingdom of Navarre. They gave him 100 ducats, with which he returned to Rome. End of Chapter 8. Section 31 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 9, Murder of Ercole Strozzi, Death of Giovanni Sforza, and of Lucretia's eldest son. Alfonso's hopes of having an heir had twice been disappointed by miscarriages, but April 4th, 1508, his wife bore him a son, who was baptized with the name of his grandfather. Ercole Strozzi regarded the birth of this heir to the throne as the fulfillment of his prophecy. In a Genethliacon, he flatters the Duchess with the hope that the deeds of her brother Caesar and of her father Alexander would be an incentive to her son. Both would remind him of Camillus and the Scipios, as well as of the heroes of Greece. Only a few weeks after this, the genial poet met with a terrible end. His devotion to Lucretia was doubtless merely that of a court gallant and poet celebrating the beauty of his patroness. The real object of his affections was Barbara Torelli, the youthful widow of Ercole Bentivoglio, who gave him the preference over another nobleman. Strozzi married her in May 1508. 13 days later, on the morning of June 6th, the poet's dead body was found near the Este Palace, which is now known as the Pareschi, wrapped in his mantle, some of his hair torn out by the roots, and wounded in 22 places. All Ferrara was in an uproar, for she owed her fame to Strozzi, one of the most imaginative poets of his time, the pet of everybody, the friend of Bembo and Ariosto, the favorite of the Duchess and of the entire court. On his father's death, he had succeeded to his position as chief of the 12 judges of Ferrara. He was still in the flower of his youth, being only 27 years old. This terrible event must have reminded Lucretia of the day when her brother Gandia was slain. The mystery attending these crimes has never been dispelled. Quote, "No one named the author of the murder, for the praetor was silent," says Paul Jovius in his eulogy of the poet. But who, except those who had the power to do so, could have compelled the court to remain silent? Some have ascribed the deed to Alfonso, stating that he destroyed Strozzi on account of his passion for the latter's wife. Others claim that he simply revenged himself for the favor which Lucretia had shown the poet. Recent writers who have endeavored to fathom the mystery and who have availed themselves of authentic records of the time regard Alfonso as the guilty one. One of the strongest proofs of his guilt is found in the fact that the Duke, who not only had punished the conspirators against his own life so cruelly, and who had always shown himself an unyielding supporter of the law, allowed the matter to drop. Lucretia has even been charged with the murder on the ground of her jealousy of Barbara Torelli, or owing to her fear that Strozzi might disclose her relations with Bembo, especially as he had hoped to obtain the cardinal's hat through the influence of the Duchess, in which he was disappointed. None of the later historians has given any credence to this theory. Ariosto did not believe it, for if he did, how could he have made Ercole Strozzi the herald of her fame in the temple of honor in which he placed the women of the house of Este? Even if he wrote this stanza before the poet's death, which is not probable, he would certainly have changed it before the publication of the poem, which was in 1516. Nor did Aldo Manuzio believe in Lucretia's guilt, for in 1513 he dedicated to her an edition of the poems of the two Strozzi, father and son, accompanied by an introduction in which he praises her to the skies. In the meantime, Julius II had formed the League of Cambrai, which was to crush Venice, and which Ferrara had also joined. The war kept Alfonso away from his domain much of the time, and consequently he made Lucretia regent during his absence. In former days she had occasionally acted as regent in the Vatican and in Spoleto, but in a different way. In 1509 she saw the war clouds gathering about Ferrara, for it was in that year that her husband and the cardinal attacked the Venetian fleet on the Po. August 25th of this same year, Lucretia bore a second son, Ippolito. The war which convulsed the entire peninsula immediately drew Ferrara into the great movement which did not subside until Charles V imposed a new order of things on the affairs of Italy. Lucretia's subsequent life, therefore, was largely influenced by politics. Her first peaceful years in Ferrara, like her youth, were past. She now devoted herself to the education of her children, the princes of Este, and to affairs of state whenever her husband entrusted them to her. She was a capable woman. her father was not mistaken in his opinion of her intellect. She made herself felt as regent in Ferrara. She was regent for the first time in May 1506, and she acquitted herself most creditably. The Jews in Ferrara were being oppressed, and Lucretia had a law passed to protect them, and all who transgressed it were severely punished. In the dedication of the poems of the Strozzi, addressed to her by Aldo, he lauds, among her other good qualities, not only her fear of God, her benevolence to the poor, and her kindness toward her relatives, but also her ability as a ruler, saying that she made an excellent regent, whose sound opinions and perspicacity were greatly admired by the burghers. Even if we make allowances for the flattery, there is still much truth in what he says. Owing to these facts, it is not strange that Lucretia's personality was quite obliterated or eclipsed by the political history of Ferrara during this period. The chroniclers of the city make no mention of her except on the occasion of the birth of her children, and Paul Jovius speaks of her only 2 or 3 times in his biography of Alfonso, although in each case with the greatest respect. The personal interest which the early career of this woman had excited died out with a change in her life. Even her letters to Alfonso and those to her friend Isabella Gonzaga contained little of importance to her biographers. No one now questioned her virtues. Even the Emperor Maximilian, who had endeavored to prevent her marriage with Alfonso, acknowledged them. One day in February 1510, in Augsburg, while in conversation with the Ferrarese ambassador Girolamo Cassola, having discussed the ladies and the festivities of Augsburg at length, he questioned the ambassador about the women of Italy, and especially about those of Ferrara, whereupon, quote, "much was said regarding the good qualities of our Duchess. I spoke of her beauty, her graciousness, her modesty, and her virtues. The Emperor asked me what other beauties there were in Ferrara, and I named Donna Diana and Donna Agnola, one the sister and the other the wife of Ercole d'Este." Such was the report the ambassador sent to Ferrara. Lucretia's nature had become more composed, thanks to the stability of the world to which she now belonged, and owing to the important duties she now had, and only rarely was it disturbed by any reminder of her experiences in Rome. The death of Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro, however, in 1510, served to recall her early life. On returning to his state, Sforza had been confirmed in its possession as a vassal of the Church by a bull of Julius II. He endeavored to rule wisely, made many improvements, and strengthened the castle of Pesaro. He was a cultivated man, given over to the study of philosophy. Ratti, a biographer of the house of Sforza, mentions a catalogue which he compiled of the entire archives of Pesaro. In 1504 he married a noble Venetian, Ginevra, of the house of Tiepolo, whose acquaintance he had made while in exile. November 4th, 1505, she bore him a son, Costanzo. What were his exact relations with the Este, with whom he was connected, we do not know, although they, doubtless, were not altogether pleasant. Sforza could not have found much pleasure in life, for his famous house was fast becoming extinct, and he could not foresee a long future for his race. He died peacefully, July 27, 1510, in the castle of Gradara, where he had been in the habit of spending much of his time alone. As his son was still a small child, his natural brother Galeazzo, who had married Ginevra, a daughter of Ercole Bentivoglio, assumed the government of Pesaro. Giovanni's child died August 15, 1512, whereupon Pope Julius II withdrew his support from Galeazzo and forced the last of the Sforza of Pesaro to enter into an agreement by which, October 30, 1512, he surrendered the castle and domain to Francesco Maria Rovere, who had been the Duke of Urbino since the death of Guidobaldo in April 1508. Pesaro, therefore, was united with this state. Galeazzo died in Milan in 1515, having made the Duke Maximilian Sforza his heir. The line of the lords of Pesaro thus became extinct, for Giovanni Sforza had left only a natural daughter, Isabella, who in 1520 married Cernigi Cipriano, a noble Florentine, and who died in Rome in 1561, famous for her culture and intellect. Her epitaph may still be read on a stone in the wall of the passageway behind the tribune in the Lateran Basilica. The death of Lucretia's first husband must have vividly reminded her of the wrong she had done him, because she had now reached the age when frivolity no longer dulled conscience. But the times were so troublous that she directed her thoughts into other channels. August 9, 1510, a few days after the death of Sforza, Julius II placed Alfonso under his ban and declared that he had forfeited all his church fiefs. The Pope again took up the plans of his uncle Sixtus, who, in conjunction with the Venetians, had schemed to wrest Ferrara from the Este. After the Venetians had appeased him by withdrawing from the cities of Romagna, he had made peace with the Republic and commanded Alfonso to withdraw from the League and to cease warring against Venice. The Duke refused, and this was the reason for the ban. Ferrara thereupon, together with France, found itself drawn into a ruinous war which led to the famous Battle of Ravenna, April 1, 1512, which was won by Alfonso's artillery. It was during this war, and on the occasion of the attempt of Julius II to capture Ferrara by surprise, that the famous Bayard made the acquaintance of Lucretia. After the French cavaliers, with their companions in arms, the Ferrarese, had captured the fortress, they returned in triumph to Ferrara, where they were received with the greatest honours. In remembrance of this occasion, the biographer Bayard wrote in praise of Lucretia as follows, quote, "The good Duchess received the French before all the others with every mark of favour. She is a pearl in this world. She daily gave the most wonderful festivals and banquets in the Italian fashion. I venture to say that neither in her time nor for many years before has there been such a glorious princess, for she is beautiful and good, gentle and amiable to everyone. And nothing is more certain than this, that although her husband is a skilful and brave prince, the above-named lady, by her graciousness, has been of great service to him." Owing to the death of Gaston de Foix at the Battle of Ravenna, the victory of the French turned to defeat, and the rout of the Pope into victory. Alfonso, finding himself defenceless, hastened to Rome in July 1512 to ask forgiveness from Julius, and although this was accorded him, he was saved from destruction, or a fate similar to Caesar Borgia's, only by secret flight. With the help of the Colonna, who conducted him to Marino, he reached Ferrara in disguise. These were anxious days for Lucretia, for while she was trembling for the life of her husband, she received news of the death abroad of her son. August 28, 1512, the Mantuan agent Stazio Gadio wrote his master Gonzaga from Rome, saying news had reached there that the Duke of Bizelli, son of the Duchess of Ferrara and Don Alfonso of Aragon, had died at Bari, where he was living under the care of the Duchess of that place. Lucretia herself gave this information to a person whose name is not known, in a letter dated October 1st, saying, quote, "I am wholly lost in bitterness and tears on account of the death of the Duke of Bizelli, my dear son, concerning which the bearer of this will give you further particulars." We do not know how the unfortunate Rodrigo spent the first years following Alexander's death and Caesar's exile in Spain, but there is ground for believing that he was left in Naples under the guardianship of the Cardinals Lucretia Borgia and the Romolini of Sorrento. By virtue of a previous agreement, the King of Spain recognized Lucretia's son as Duke of Bizelli, and there is an official document of September 1505, according to which the representative of the little Duke placed his oath of allegiance in the hands of the two cardinals above named. Rodrigo may have been brought up by his aunt, Donna Sancha, for she was living with her husband in the kingdom of Naples, where Don Giuffre had been confirmed in the possession of his property. Sancha died childless in the year 1506, just as Ferdinand the Catholic appeared in Naples. The king consequently appropriated a large part of Don Giuffre's estates, although the latter remained Prince of Squillace. He married a second time and left several heirs. Of his end we know nothing. One of his grandchildren, Anna de Borgia, Princess of Squillace, the last of her race, brought these estates to the house of Gandia by her marriage with Don Francesco Borgia at the beginning of the 17th century. It may have been on the death of Sancha that Rodrigo was placed under the protection of another aunt, Isabella d'Aragona, his father's eldest sister, the most unfortunate woman of the age, wife of Gian Galeazzo of Milan, who had been poisoned by Ludovico il Moro. The figure of Isabella of Milan is the most tragic in the history of Italy of the period beginning with the invasion of Charles VIII, an epic filled with a series of disasters that involved every dynasty of the country. For she was affected at one and the same time by the fall of two great houses, that of Sforza and that of Aragon. The saying of Caracciolo in his work De Varietate Fortunae regarding the Sforza, namely, that there is no tragedy, however terrible, for which this house would not furnish an abundance of material, may well be applied to both these families. Isabella had beheld the fall of her once mighty house, and she had seen her own son, Francesco, seized and taken to France by Louis XII, where he died a priest in his early manhood. She herself had retired to Bari, a city which Ludovico il Moro had given up to her in 1499, and of which she remained duchess until her death, February 11, 1524. Donna Isabella had taken Lucretia's son to herself, and from the records of the household expenses of the Duchess of Ferrara, it appears that he was with her in Bari in March 1505, for on the 26th of that month there is the following entry, quote, "A suit of damask and brocade which Her Majesty sent to her son Don Rodrigo in Bari as a present." April 3rd, his mother sent his tutor, Baldassare Bonfiglio, who had come to Naples, back to him. This man is named in the register under date of February 25th, 1506, as tutor of Don Giovanni. It appears, therefore, that this child also was in Bari and was being educated with his playfellow Rodrigo. In October 1506, we find the little Giovanni in Carpi, where he was probably placed at the court of the Pio. From there, Lucretia had him brought to the court of Ferrara on the date mentioned. She therefore was allowed to have this mysterious infante, but not her own child Rodrigo, with her. In November 1506, Giovanni must again have been in Carpi, for Lucretia sent him some fine linen apparel to that place. Both children were together again in Bari in April 1508, for in the record of the household expenses, the expenditures for both, beginning with May of that year, are given together, and a certain Don Bartolomeo Grotto is mentioned as instructor to both. The son of Lucretia and of the murdered Alfonso, therefore, died in the home of Donna Isabella in Bari, which was not far from his hereditary duchy of Bizelli. We have a letter written by this unhappy Princess Isabella a few weeks after the death of the youthful Rodrigo to Perot Castellar, governor of Bizelli. Monsignor Perot, we write this merely to ask you to compel those of Corato to pay us what they have to pay from the revenue of the illustrious Duke of Bizelli, our nephew of blessed memory, for shortly a bill will come from the illustrious Duchess of Ferrara, and in case the money is not ready, we might be caused great inconvenience. Those of Corato may delay, and we might be compelled to find the money at once. Therefore, you must see to it that we are not subjected to any further inconvenience, and that we are paid immediately, for by doing so you will oblige us, and we offer ourselves to your service. Isabella of Aragon, Duchess of Milan, alone in misfortune. Bari, October 14th, 1592. Rodrigo's mother laid claim to the property he left, which, as is shown by certain documents, she recovered from Isabella d'Aragona as guardian of the deceased, to the amount of several thousand ducats. To do this, she was forced to engage in a long suit, and as late as March 1518 she sent her agent, Giacomo Naselli, to Rome and Naples regarding it. His report to Cardinal Ippolito is still in existence. Whatever were the circumstances which had compelled Lucretia to send her son away, on whom, as we have shown, she always lavished her maternal care, the unfortunate child's experience will always be a blot on her memory. End of Chapter 9. Section 32 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 10, Effects of the War, the Roman Infante. The war about Ferrara, thanks to Alfonso's skill and the determined resistance of the state, had ended. Julius II had seized Modena and Reggio, which was a great loss to the state of Ferrara, and consequently the history of that country for many years hence is taken up with her efforts to regain these cities. Fortunately for Alfonso, Julius II died in February 1513, and Leo X ascended the papal throne. Hitherto he had maintained friendly relations with the princes of Urbino and Ferrara, who continued to look for only amicable treatment from him. But both houses were destined to be bitterly deceived by the faithless Medici, who deceived all the world. Alfonso hastened to attend Leo's coronation in Rome, and, believing a complete reconciliation with the Holy See would soon be effected, he returned to Ferrara. There Lucretia had won universal esteem and affection. She had become the mother of the people. She lent a ready ear to the suffering, and helped all who were in need. Famine, high prices, and depletion of the treasury were the consequences of the war. Lucretia had even pawned her jewels. She put aside, as Jovius says, quote, the pomps and vanities of the world to which she had been accustomed from childhood, and gave herself up to pious works, and founded convents and hospitals. This was due as much to her own nature as it was to her past life and the fate she had suffered. Most women who have lived much and loved much finally become fanatics. Bigotry is often only the last form which feminine vanity assumes. The recollection of a world of vice and of crimes committed by her nearest kinsmen, and also of her own sins, must have constantly disturbed Lucretia's conscience. Other women who, like her, were among the chief characters in the history of the Borgias developed precisely the same frame of mind and experienced a similar need of religious consolation. Caesar's widow ended her life in a convent. Gandia's did the same. Alexander's mistress became a fanatic, and if we had any record of the adulteress Julia Farnese, we should certainly find that she passed the closing years of her life either as a saint in a convent or engaged in pious works. The year 1513, following the war in Ferrara, marked a decided change in Lucretia's life, for from that time it took a special religious turn. It did not, however, degenerate into bigotry or fanaticism. This was prevented by the vigorous Alfonso and her children, and by her court duties. The war had deprived Ferrara of much of its brilliancy, although it was still one of the most attractive of the princely courts of Italy. During the following years of peace, Alfonso devoted himself to the cultivation of the arts. The most famous masters of Ferrara, Dossi, Garofalo, and Michele Costa, worked for him in the castle in Bel Riguardo and Belfiore. Titian, who was frequently a guest in Ferrara, executed some paintings for him, and the Duke likewise gave Raphael some commissions. He even found a museum of antiquities. In Lucretia's cabinet there was a Cupid by Michelangelo. The predilection of the Duchess for the fine arts, however, was not very strong. In this respect she was not to be compared with her sister-in-law, Isabella of Mantua, who maintained constant relations with all the prominent artists of the age, and had her agents in all the large cities of Italy to keep her informed regarding noteworthy productions in the domain of the arts. From 1513, Ferrara's brilliancy was somewhat dimmed by the greater fame of the court of Leo X. The passion of this member of the Medici family for the arts attracted to Rome the most brilliant men of Italy, among whom were the poets Tabaldeo, Saldoletto, and Bembo, the last becoming Leo's secretary. Both the Strozzi were dead. Aldo, upon whose career as a printer and scholar during his early years Lucretia had not been without influence, was living in Venice, and from there he kept up a literary correspondence with his patroness. Celio Calcagnini remained true to Ferrara. The university continued to flourish. Lucretia was very friendly with the noble Venetian Trissino, Ariosto's not altogether successful rival in epic poetry. There are in existence 5 letters written by Trissino to Lucretia in her last years. Ferrara's pride, however, was Ariosto, and Lucretia knew him when he was at the zenith of his fame. He, however, dedicated his poem neither to her nor to Alfonso, but to the unworthy Cardinal Ippolito, in whose service a combination of circumstances had placed him. No princely house was ever glorified more highly than was the house of Este by Ariosto, for the Orlando Furioso will cause it to be remembered for all time. So long as the Italian language endures, it will hold an immortal place in literature. Lucretia too was given a position of honor in the poem, but however beautiful the place which he there holds, Ariosto ought to have bestowed greater praise on her if she was the inspiration which he required for his great work. Lucretia's relations with her husband, which had never been based upon love and which were not of a passionate nature, apparently continued to grow more favorable for her. In April 1514 she had borne him a third son, Alessandro, who died at the age of 2 years. July 4th, 1515, she bore a daughter, Leonora, and November 1st, 1516, another son, Francesco. With no little satisfaction, Alfonso found himself the father of a number of children, all his legitimate heirs. He was engrossed in his own affairs, but nevertheless he was highly pleased with the esteem and admiration now bestowed upon his wife. While the admiration she excited in former years was due to her youthful beauty, it was now owing to her virtues. She, who was once the most execrated woman of her age, had won a place of the highest honor. Caviccio even ventured, when he wished to praise the famous Isabella Gonzaga, to say that she approached the perfection of Lucretia. Her past apparently was so completely forgotten that even her name, Borgia, was always mentioned with respect. About this time Lucretia was reminded of her life in Rome by a member of her family who was very near to her, Giovanni Borgia, the mysterious Infante of Rome, formerly Duke of Nepi and Camerino, and companion in destiny of the little Rodrigo, who died in Bari. He had disappeared from the stage in 1508, and where he was during several succeeding years we do not know. But in 1517, a young man of 19 or 20, he came from Naples to Romagna, where he was shipwrecked. His baggage had been saved by the commune of Pesaro, and was claimed by a representative of Lucretia December 2nd. In the legal document, Giovanni Borgia was described as her, quote, brother. Other instruments show that he remained at his sister's court as late as December 1517. Her husband, therefore, did not refuse to allow her to shelter her kinsman. In December 1518, Don Giovanni went to France, where the Duke Alfonso had him presented to the king. Lucretia had given him presents to take to the king and queen. He remained at the French court some time for the purpose of making his fortune, in which, however, he did not succeed. Thereupon the Infante of Rome again disappeared from view until the year 1530, when we find him in Rome laying claim to the Duchy of Camerino. The last Verano, Giamaria, had returned thither on Caesar's overthrow, and had been recognized by Julius II as a vassal of the Church. In April 1515, Leo X made him Duke of Camerino and married him to his own niece, the beautiful Caterina Cibo. Giamaria died in August 1527, leaving as his sole heir his daughter Giulia, who was not yet of age. An illegitimate son of the house of Verano laid claim to Camerino, and he was ready to enforce his demands with arms, but he was frustrated in his attempt by a suit brought by Giovanni Borgia, the first duke, who was supported by Alfonso of Ferrara in his efforts. He furnished him with several documents dating from the time of Alexander VI, which referred to his rights to Camerino, and which had been placed by Lucretia in the chancellery of the house of Este. Don Giovanni had even gone to Charles V in Bologna, where the famous Congress had been sitting since December 1529. The emperor had advised him to endeavor to secure his rights by process of law in Rome through the Pope. From that city, in 1530, the Infante wrote a letter to Duke Alfonso, in which he informed him of his affairs and asked him to have further search made in the archives of the Este for documents concerning himself. Don Giovanni began suit. In a voluminous document dated June 29, 1530, he describes himself not only as Domicellus Romanus Principalis, but also as, quote, orator of the Pope. From this it appears that he, one of the illegitimate sons of Alexander VI, was a prominent gentleman in Rome and was even in the Pope's service. The Roman Rota decided the suit against Giovanni, who had to pay the costs. In a brief dated June 7, 1532, Clement VII commanded him to cease annoying Giulia Verano and her mother with any further claims. From that time we hear nothing more of this Borgia, except from a letter written in Rome, November 19, 1547, apparently by a Ferrarese agent to Ercole II, then reigning duke. In it he mentions the death of Don Giovanni. The letter is as follows. Don Giovanni Borgia has just died in Genoa. It is said he left many thousand ducats in Valencia. Here, in Rome, he had a little clothing, 2 horses, and a vineyard worth about 300 ducats. As he left no will, the property will be divided between your Excellency, your brothers, and among others, the nobles of the Mattei family here, the Duke of Gandia, and the children of the Duke of Valentino, provided their rights are not prejudiced by the fact that they are natural children. I will not omit to inform myself regarding the money in Valencia, and will report to your Excellency. End of Chapter 10. Section 33 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 11, Last Years and Death of Venozza. In the same year that her father's last son appeared at her court, Lucretia also learned of the death of her mother. Venozza was already a widow when Alexander VI died. During his last illness, she had placed herself under the protection of the troops of her son Caesar. This she was able to do as he himself was sick at the same time. There are documents in existence which show that immediately after Alexander's death, and while the papal throne was vacant, she was living in the palace of the Cardinal of San Clemente in the Borgo. As Caesar was compelled to betake himself to Nepi, she accompanied him thither, and on the election of Piccolomini she returned to the papal city. She did not follow her sons to Naples, but remained in Rome, where affairs became normal after the election of Rovere to the papacy. The retainers of the Borgia feared that certain suits would be brought against them. March 6, 1504, a chamberlain of Cardinal Sant'Angelo, who had been poisoned, was condemned to death, and in a loud voice he proclaimed that he had committed the murder on the explicit command of Alexander and Caesar. Cardinals Romolini and Ludovico Borgia at once fled to Naples. Don Micheletto, the man who executed Caesar's bloody orders, was a prisoner in the castle of Sant'Angelo. The Venetian ambassador, Justinian, informed his government in May 1504 that Micheletto was charged with having caused the death of a number of persons, among them the Duke of Gandia, Verano of Camerino, Astore and Ottaviano Manfredi, the Duke of Bizelli, the youthful Bernardino of Sermoneta, and the Bishop of Cagli. Micheletto was brought before the representatives of the Senate for examination. He was placed upon the rack and confessed, among other things, that it was the Pope Alexander himself who had given the command for the murder of the youthful Alfonso of Bizelli. This the magistrate immediately reported to Ferrara. As Caesar was out of the way, Venozza was still able to reckon on the protection of certain powerful friends, especially the Farnese, the Cesarini, and several cardinals. She feared her property would be confiscated, for the title too much of it was questionable. Early in 1504, Ludovico Mattei charged her with having stolen, in March 1503, through her paid servants, 1,160 sheep, while Caesar was carrying on his war against the Orsini. These sheep had been sent by Maria d'Aragona, wife of Giovanni Giordano Orsini, to Mattei's pastures for safety. Venozza was found guilty. She endeavored in every way to save her property. December 4th, 1503, she gave the church of Santa Maria del Popolo a deed of her house on the Piazza Pizzo di Merlo and of her family chapel, reserving the use of it during her life. The Augustinians, on their part, bound themselves to say a Mass for Carlo Canale, March 24th, another October 13th for Giorgio di Croce, and a third on the day of Venozza's own death. In this instrument she calls herself widow of Carlo Canale of Mantua, apostolic secretary of the deceased Alexander VI, and she speaks of Giorgio di Croce as her first husband. This deed was executed in the Borgo of St. Peter's in the residence of Agapitus of Aemilia. From this it appears that at the close of December, Venozza was still living in the Borgo and under the protection of her son's own chancellor, while Caesar himself was a prisoner in the Torre Borgia in the Vatican, and not until he left Rome forever did she remove from the Borgo. April 1st, 1504, a dwelling on the Piazza of the Holy Apostles in the Trevi Quarter, which was situated in a district where the Colonna were all-powerful, was specified as her residence. The Colonna had suffered less from others from Caesar, and by virtue of an agreement made with them, they were enabled to retain their property after the death of Alexander. Venazia had sold certain other houses which she owned to the Roman Giuliano de Lenis, and April 1st, 1504, he annulled the sale, declaring that it was only through fear of force in consequence of the death of Alexander that it had taken place. As she now had nothing more to fear, she again took up her abode in the house on the Piazza Branca, as is shown by an instrument of November 1502, in which she is described as, quote, Donna Venozia di Catenaeus of the Regula Quarter, where this house was situated. This document is regarding a complaint which the goldsmith Nardo Antonazzi of this same quarter had lodged against her. The artist demanded payment for a silver cross which he had made for Venozia in the year 1500. He charged her with having appropriated this work of art without paying for it, which he stated frequently happened, quote, at the time when the Duke of Valentino controlled the whole city and nearly all of Italy. We have not all the documents bearing on the case, but from the statements of witnesses for the accused, it appears that she had grounds for bringing a suit for libel. While Venozia may not have been actually placed in possession of the castle of Bleda near Viterbo by Alexander VI, some of its appanage were allotted to her. July 6, 1513, she complained to the cardinal vicar Raffaele Riario that the commune of the place was withholding certain sums of money which she claimed belonged to her. This document, which is on parchment, is couched in pompous phraseology and is addressed to all the magistrates of the world by name and title. Venozia lived to witness the changes in affairs in the Vatican under 3 of Alexander's successors. There the Rovere and the Medici occupied the place once held by her own all-powerful children. She saw the papacy changing into a secular power, and she must have known that, but for Alexander and Caesar, it could never have done this. If, perchance, she saw from a distance the mighty Julius II, for example, when he returned to Rome after seizing Bologna, entering the city with the pomp of an emperor, this woman, lost in the multitude, must have exclaimed with bitter irony that her own Caesar had a part in this triumph, and that he had been instrumental in raising Julius II to the papacy. It must have been a source of no little satisfaction to her to know that this pope recognized her son's importance when he wrote to the Florentines in November 1503, saying that, quote, on account of the preeminent virtues and great services of the Duke of Romagna, he loved him with a father's love. She may also have been acquainted with Machiavelli's Prince, in which the genial statesman describes Caesar as the ideal ruler. Although the power of the Borgias had passed away and their children were either dead or scattered, their greatness was felt in the city as long as Venozia lived. Her past experiences caused her to be looked upon as one of the most noteworthy personalities of Rome, where everyone was curious to make her acquaintance. If we may compare 2 persons who differed in greatness, but whose destinies and positions were not dissimilar, it might be said that Venozia at that time occupied the same position in Rome in which Lucretia Bonaparte found herself after the overthrow of her powerful offspring. She looked with pride on her daughter, the Duchess of Ferrara, quote, la plus triomphante princesse, as the biographer Bayard calls her. She never saw her again, for she would scarcely have ventured to undertake a journey to Ferrara, but she continued to correspond with her. In the archives of the House of Este are 9 letters written by Venozia in the years 1515, 1516, and 1517. 7 of them are addressed to Cardinal Ippolito and 2 to Lucretia. These letters are not in her own handwriting, but are dictated. They disclose a powerful will, a cast of mind that might be described as rude and egotistical, and an insinuating character. They are devoted chiefly to practical matters and to requests of various sorts. On one occasion she sent the cardinal a present of 2 antique columns which had been exhumed in her vineyard. She also kept up her intercourse with her son Giuffre, Prince of Squillace. In 1515 she had received his 10-year-old son into her house in Rome, apparently for the purpose of educating him. An expression which Vanozza used in signing her letters defines her attitude and position, quote, "the fortunate and unfortunate Vanozza di Cataneius," or, quote, "your fortunate and unfortunate mother, Vanozza Borgia." She used the family name in her private affairs, but not officially. Her last letter to Lucretia, written December 19, 1515, which refers to her son Caesar's former secretary, Agapitus of Emilia, is as follows. Illustrious Lady, my greeting and respects. Your Excellency will certainly remember favorably the services of Messer Agapitus of Emilia to His Excellency our Duke, and the love which he has always shown us. It is therefore meet that his kinsman be helped and advanced in every way possible. Shortly before his death, he relinquished all his benefices in favor of his nephew Giambattista of Aquila. Among them are some in the bishopric of Capua which are worth very little. If your Excellency wishes to do me a kindness, I will ask you, for the reasons above mentioned, to interest yourself in behalf of these nephews to whom I have referred. Nicola, the bearer of this, who is himself a nephew of Agapitus, will explain to your Excellency at length what should be done. And now farewell to your Excellency, to whom I commend myself. Rome, December 19th, 1515. Postscript. In this matter your Excellency will do as you think best, as I have written the above from a sense of obligation. Therefore you may do only what you know will please his worthiness, and, so far as the present is concerned, you may answer as you see fit. Vanozza, who prays for you constantly. Vanozza clearly was an honor to the Borgia school of diplomacy. Agapitus de Gerardi, who wrote so many of Caesar's letters and documents, had remained true to the Borgias, as is shown by this letter, until his death, which occurred in Rome August 2, 1515. Vanozza, of a truth, had seen many of the former friends, flatterers, and parasites of her house deserted, but a number, among whom were several important personages, remained true. She, as mother of the Duchess of Ferrara, was still able to exert some influence. She was living a respectable life, in comfortable circumstances, as a woman of position, and was described as La Magnifica e Nobile, Madonna Vanozza. She also kept up her relations with such of the cardinals as were Spaniards and relatives of Alexander VI, or who were his creatures. She survived most of them. Of the 2 cardinals, Giovanni Borgia, one had passed away in 1500, the other in 1503. Francesco and Ludovico died in 1511 and 1512, respectively. Cardinal Giuliano Cesarini passed away in 1510. Vanozza, in fact, survived all the favorites and creatures of Alexander in the College of Cardinals, with the exception of Farnese, Adrian Castellesi, and d'Albret, Caesar's brother-in-law. By that sort of piety to which senescent female sinners everywhere and at all times devote themselves, she secured new friends. She was an active fanatic, and was constantly seen in the churches, at the confessionals, and in intimate intercourse with the pious brothers and hospitallers. In this way she made the acquaintance of Paul Jovius, who describes her as an upright woman, donna da bene. If she had lived another decade, she would probably have been canonized. She endowed a number of religious foundations, the hospitals of San Salvatore in the Lateran, of Santa Maria in Porticu, the Consolazione for the Company of the Annunziata in the Minerva, and the San Lorenzo in Damaso, as is shown by her will, which is dated January 15, 1517. For years there were inscriptions in the hospitals of the Lateran and of the Consolazione, which referred to her endowments, and also to provisions for masses on the anniversaries of her death and those of her 2 husbands. Vanozza died in Rome, November 26, 1518. Her death did not pass unnoticed, as the following letter, written by a Venetian, shows. The day before yesterday died Madonna Vanozza, once the mistress of Pope Alexander and mother of the Duchess of Ferrara and the Duke of Valentino. That night I happened to be at a place where I heard the death announced, according to the Roman custom, in the following formal words. Quote, Messer Paolo gives notice of the death of Madonna Vanozza, mother of the Duke of Gandia. She belonged to the Gonfalone Company. Close quote. She was buried yesterday in Santa Maria del Popolo with the greatest honors, almost like a cardinal. She was 66 years of age. She left all her property, which was not inconsiderable, to San Giovanni in Laterano. The Pope's chamberlain attended the obsequies, which was unusual. Marcantonio Altieri, one of the foremost men of Rome, who was guardian of the company of the Gonfalone ad Sanctum Sanctorum, and as such made an inventory of the property of the Brotherhood in 1527, drew up a memorial regarding her, the manuscript of which is still preserved in the archives of the association and is as follows. We must not forget the endowments made by the respected and honored lady Madonna Vanozza of the House of Catanei, the happy mother of the illustrious gentlemen, the Duke of Gandia, the Duke of Valentino, the Prince of Squillace, and of Madonna Lucretia, Duchess of Ferrara. As she wished to endow the company with her worldly goods, she gave it her jewels, which were of no slight value, and so much more that the company in a few years was able to discharge certain obligations, with the help also of the noble gentleman, Messer Mariano Castellano, and my dear Messer Raphael Casale, who had recently been guardians. She made an agreement with a great and famous silversmith, Caradosso, by which she gave him 2,000 ducats, so that he, with his magnificent work of art, might gratify the wish of that noble and honorable woman. In addition, she left us so much property that we shall be able to take care of the annual rent of 400 ducats, and also feed the poor and the sick, who, unfortunately, are very numerous. Out of gratitude for her piety and devout mind, and for these endowments, our honorable society unanimously and cheerfully decided not only to celebrate her obsequies with magnificent pomp, but also to honor the deceased with a proud and splendid monument. It was also decided from that time forth to have Mass said on the anniversary of her death in the Church del Popolo, where she is buried, and to provide for other ceremonies, with an attendance of men bearing torches and tapers, in all devotion, for the purpose of commending her soul's salvation to God, and also to show the world that we hate and loathe ingratitude. Thus this woman's vanity led her to provide for a ceremonious funeral. She wanted all Rome to talk of her on that day as the mistress of Alexander VI and the mother of so many famous children. Leo X bestowed an official character upon her funeral by having his court attended. By doing this, he recognized Vanozza either as the widow of Alexander VI or as the mother of the Duchess of Ferrara. As the company of the Gonfalone was composed of the foremost burghers and nobles of Rome, almost the entire city attended her funeral. Vanozza was buried in Santa Maria del Popolo, in her family chapel, by the side of her unfortunate son Giovanni, Duke of Gandia. We do not know whether a marble monument was erected to her memory, but the following inscription was placed over her grave by her executor. Quote, to Venotia Catanea, mother of the Duke Caesar of Valentino, Giovanni of Gandia, Giuffre of Squillace, and Lucretia of Ferrara, conspicuous for her uprightness, her piety, her discretion, and her intelligence, and deserving much on account of what she did for the Lateran Hospital. Erected by Hieronymus Picus, fiduciary commissioner and executor of her will. She lived 77 years, 4 months, and 13 days. She died in the year 1518, November 26th. Vanozza doubtless had passed away believing that she had expiated her sins and purchased heaven with gold and silver and pious legacies. She had even purchased the pomp of a ceremonious funeral and a lie which was graven deep on her tombstone. For more than 200 years, the priests in Santa Maria del Popolo sang masses for the repose of her soul, and when they ceased it, it was perhaps less owing to their conviction that enough of them had been said for this woman than from a growing belief in the trustworthiness of historical criticism. Later, owing either to hate or a sense of shame, her very tombstone disappeared, not a trace of it being left. End of Chapter 11. Section 34 of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Emily Maynard. Book 2, Chapter 12, Death of Lucretia Borgia. Conclusion. The state of Ferrara again found itself in serious difficulties, for Leo X, following the example of Alexander VI, was trying to build up a kingdom for his nephew Lorenzo de' Medici. As early as 1516, Leo had made him Duke of Urbino, having expelled Guidobaldo's legitimate heirs from their city. Francesco Maria Rovere, his wife, and his adopted mother Elisabetta were in Mantua, the asylum of all exiled princes. Leo was consuming with a desire also to drive the Este out of Ferrara, and it was only the protection of France that saved Alfonso from a war with the Pope. The Duke, to whom the Pope refused to restore the cities of Modena and Reggio, therefore went to the court of Louis XII in November 1518 for the purpose of interesting him in his affairs. In February 1519 he returned to Ferrara, where he learned of the death of his brother-in-law, the Marchese Francesco Gonzaga of Mantua, which occurred February 20th. The last of March, Lucretia wrote to his widow, Isabella, as follows. Illustrious Lady, Sister-in-law, and most honored Sister, the great loss by death of your Excellency's husband of blessed memory has caused me such profound grief that, instead of being able to offer consolation, I myself am in need of it. I sympathize with your Excellency in this loss, and I cannot tell you how grieved and depressed I am. But, as it has occurred, and it has pleased our Lord so to do, we must acquiesce in his will. Therefore I beg and urge your Majesty to bear up under this misfortune as befits your position, and I know that you will do so. I will at present merely add that I commend myself and offer my services to you at all times. Your sister-in-law, Lucretia, Duchess of Ferrara. Ferrara, the last of March, 1519. The Marchese was succeeded by his eldest son, Federico. In 1530, the Emperor Charles V created him first Duke of Mantua. The following year, he married Margherita di Montferrat. This was the same Federico who had formerly been selected to be the husband of Caesar's daughter, Louisa. His famous mother lived, a widow, until February 13, 1539. Alfonso again found his wife in a precarious condition. She was near her confinement, and June 14, 1519, she bore a child which was stillborn. 8 days later, knowing that her end was near, she dictated an epistle to Pope Leo. It is the last letter we have of Lucretia, and as it was written while she was dying, it is of the deepest import, enabling us to look into her soul, which for the last time was tormented by the recollection of the terrors and errors of her past life, of which she had long since purged herself. Most Holy Father and honored Master, with all respect I kiss your Holiness's feet and commend myself in all humility to your holy mercy. Having suffered for more than 2 months, early on the morning of the 14th of the present, as it pleased God, I gave birth to a daughter, and hoped then to find relief from my sufferings. But I did not, and I shall be compelled to pay my debt to nature. So great is the favor which our merciful Creator has shown me, that I approach the end of my life with pleasure, knowing that in a few hours, after receiving for the last time all the holy sacraments of the Church, I shall be released. Having arrived at this moment, I desire as a Christian, although I am a sinner, to ask your Holiness, in your mercy, to give me all possible spiritual consolation and your Holiness's blessing for my soul. Therefore I offer myself to you in all humility, and commend my husband and my children, all of whom are your servants, to your Holiness's mercy. In Ferrara, June 22nd, 1519, at the 14th hour. Your Holiness's humble servant, Lucretia d'Este. The letter is so calm and contained, so free from affectation, that one is inclined to ask whether a dying woman could have written it if her conscience had been burdened with the crimes with which Alexander's unfortunate daughter had been charged. She died in the presence of Alfonso on the night of June 24th, and the Duke immediately wrote his nephew Federico Gonzaga as follows. Illustrious Sir and honoured brother and nephew, it has just pleased our Lord to summon unto himself the soul of the illustrious lady, the Duchess, my dearest wife. I hasten to inform you of the fact, as our mutual love leads me to believe that the happiness or unhappiness of one is likewise the happiness or unhappiness of the other. I cannot write this without tears, knowing myself to be deprived of such a dear and sweet companion. For such her exemplary conduct and the tender love which existed between us made her to me. On this sad occasion I would indeed seek consolation from your Excellency, but I know that you will participate in my grief, and I prefer to have someone mingle his tears with mine rather than endeavour to console me. I commend myself to your Majesty. Ferrara, June 24th, 1519, at the 5th hour of the night. Alphonsus, Duke of Ferrara. The Marchese Federico sent his uncle Giovanni Gonzaga to Ferrara, who wrote him from there as follows. Your Excellency must not be surprised when I tell you that I shall leave here tomorrow, for no obsequies will be celebrated, only the offices said in the parish church. His Excellency the Duke accompanied his illustrious consort's body to the grave. She is buried in the convent of the Sisters of Corpus Christi, in the same vault where repose the remains of his mother. Her death has caused the greatest grief throughout the entire city, and His Ducal Majesty displays the most profound sorrow. Great things are reported concerning her life, and it is said that she has worn the cilice for about 10 years, and has gone to confession daily during the last 2 years, and has received the communion 3 or 4 times every month. Your Excellency's ever devoted servant, Johannes de Gonzaga, Marquis. Ferrara, June 28, 1519. Among the numerous letters of condolence which the Duke received was one in Spanish from the mysterious Infante Don Giovanni Borgia, who was then in Poissy, France. The Duke himself had informed him of the death of his consort, and Don Giovanni lamented the loss of his sister, who had also been his greatest patron. The graves of Lucretia and Alfonso, and numerous other members of the House of Este in Ferrara, have disappeared. No picture of the famous woman exists either in that city or in Modena. Although many, doubtless, were painted, none has been preserved. In Ferrara there were numerous artists, Dossi, Garofalo, Cosma, and others. Titian may have painted the beautiful Duchess's portrait. His likeness of Isabella d'Este Gonzaga, Lucretia's rival in beauty, is preserved in the Belvedere Gallery in Vienna. It shows a charming feminine face of oval contour, with regular lines, brown eyes, and an expression of gentle womanliness. There is no portrait of Lucretia from this master's hand, for the one in the Doria Gallery in Rome, which some ascribe to him and others to Paul Veronese, although this artist was not born until 1528, is one of the many fictions we find in galleries. In the Doria Gallery there is a life-sized figure of an Amazon with a helmet in her hand, ascribed to Dosso Dossi, which is said to be a likeness of Venozza. Monsignor Antonelli, custodian of the numismatic collection of Ferrara, has a portrait in oil which may be that of Lucretia Borgia, not because it has her name in somewhat archaic letters, but because the features are not unlike those of her medals. This portrait, however, the eyes are grey, is uncertain, as are also 2 portraits in maiolica in the possession of Rawdon Brown in Venice, which he regards as the work of Alfonso himself, who amused himself in making this ware. Even if there were any grounds for this belief, the portraits, as they are merely in the decorative style of the maiolica, would resemble the original but slightly. The portrait in the Dresden Gallery, which is catalogued as a likeness of Lucretia Borgia, is not authentic. There are no undoubted portraits of her, except those on the medals which were struck during her life in Ferrara. One of these is reproduced as the frontispiece of the present volume. It is the finest of all, and is one of the most noteworthy medals of the Renaissance. It probably was engraved by Filippino Lippi in 1502 on the occasion of Lucretia's marriage. On the reverse is a design characteristic not only of the age but especially of Lucretia. It is a Cupid with outstretched wings bound to a laurel, suspended from which are a violin and a roll of music. The quiver of the god of love hangs broken on a branch of the laurel, and his bow, with a cord snapped, lies on the ground. The inscription on the reverse is as follows, quote, Virtuti ac formae pudicitia preciosissimum. Perhaps the artist, by this symbolism, wished to convey the idea that the time for love's free play had passed, and by the laurel tree intended to suggest the famous house of Este. Although this interpretation might apply to every bride, it is especially appropriate for Lucretia Borgia. Whoever examines this girlish head, with its long flowing tresses, will be surprised, for no contrast could be greater than that between this portrait and the common conception of Lucretia Borgia. The likeness shows a maidenly, almost childish face, of a peculiar expression, without any classic lines. It could scarcely be described as beautiful. The Marquesana of Cotrone spoke the truth when, in writing to Francesco, she said that Lucretia was not especially beautiful, but that she had what might be called a, quote, dolce cera, a sweet face. The face resembles that of her father, as shown by the best medals which we have of him, but slightly. The only likeness is in the strongly outlined nose. Lucretia's forehead was arched, while Alexander's was flat. Her chin was somewhat retreating, while his was in line with the lips. Another medal shows Lucretia with the hair confined and the head covered with a net, and has the so-called lenza, a sort of fillet set with precious stones or pearls. The hair covers the ears and descends to the neck, according to the fashion of the day, which we also see in a beautiful medal of Elisabetta Gonzaga of Urbino. The original sources from which the material for this book has been derived would place the reader in a position to form his own opinion regarding Lucretia Borgia, and his view would approximate a correct one, or at least would be nearer correct than the common conception of this woman. Men of past ages are merely problems which we endeavor to solve. If we err in our conception of our contemporaries, how much more likely are we to be wrong when we endeavor to analyze men whose very forms are shadowy? All the circumstances of their personal life, of their nature, the times, and their environment, of which they were the product, all the secrets of their being exist only as disconnected fragments from which we are forced to frame our conception of their characters. History is merely a world judgment based upon the law of causality. Many of the characters in history would regard their portraits in books as wholly distorted and would smile at the opinion formed of them. Lucretia Borgia might correspond with the one derived from the documents of her time, which show her as an amiable, gentle, thoughtless, and unfortunate woman. Her misfortunes in life were due in part to a fate for which she was in no way responsible, and after her death in the opinion which was formed regarding her character. The brand which had been set upon her forehead was removed by herself when she became Duchess of Ferrara, but on her death it reappeared. How soon this happened is shown by what the Rovere in Urbino said of her. In the year 1532, it was arranged that Guidobaldo II, son of Francesco Maria and Eleonora Gonzaga, should marry Giulia Varano, although he himself wished to marry a certain Orsini. His father directed his attention to the unequal alliances into which princes were prone to enter, and among others to that of Alfonso of Ferrara, who, he said, had married Lucretia Borgia, a woman, quote, of the sort which everybody knows, and who had given his son a monster, Renee, for wife. Guidobaldo acquiesced in this view, and replied that he knew he had a father who would never compel him to take a wife like Lucretia Borgia, quote, one as bad as she, and of so many disreputable connections. Thus the impression grew, and Lucretia Borgia became the type of all feminine depravity, until finally Victor Hugo, in his drama, and Donizetti, in his opera, placed her upon the stage in that character. In conclusion, a few words regarding the descendants of Lucretia and Alfonso. The Duke of Ferrara survived his wife 15 stormy years. He, however, succeeded in defending himself against the popes of the Medici family, and he revenged himself on Clement VII by sacking Rome with the aid of the emperor's troops. Charles V gave him Modena and Reggio, and he was therefore able to leave his heir the estates of the House of Este in their integrity. He never married again, but a beautiful bourgeoise, Laura Estocchia Dianti, became his mistress. She bore him 2 sons, Alfonso and Alfonsino. The Duke died October 31st, 1534, at the age of 58. His brothers, Cardinal Ippolito and Don Sigismondo, having passed away before him, the former in 1520 and the latter in 1524. By Lucretia Borgia he had 5 children. Ercole succeeded him. Ippolito became a cardinal and died December 2nd, 1572, in Tivoli, where the Villa d'Este remains as his monument. Eleonora died a nun in the convent of Corpus Domini, July 15, 1575. Francesco finally became Marchese of Massa Lombarda and died February 22, 1578. Lucretia's son Ercole reigned until October 1559. In 1528, his father had married him to Renée, the plain but intellectual daughter of Louis XII. Lucretia had never seen her daughter-in-law, nor had she ever had any intimation that it was to be Renée. The life of this famous duchess forms a noteworthy part of the history of Ferrara. She was an active supporter of the Reformation, which was inaugurated to free the world from a church which was governed by the Borgia, the Rovere, and the Medici. Renée was therefore described as a monster by the Rovere. She kept Calvin and Clement Marot in concealment at her court a long time. By a curious coincidence, in the year 1550, a man appeared at the court of Lucretia's son, who vividly recalled to the Borgias, who were still living their family history, which was already becoming legendary. This man was Don Francesco Borgia, Duke of Gandia, now a Jesuit. His sudden appearance in Ferrara gives us an opportunity briefly to describe the fortunes of the House of Gandia. Of all the progeny of Alexander VI, the most fortunate were those who were the descendants of the murdered Don Giovanni. His widow, Donna Maria, lived for a long time highly respected at the court of Queen Isabella of Castile, and subsequently she became an ascetic bigot and entered a convent. Her daughter Isabella did the same, dying in 1537. Her only son, Don Giovanni, while a child, had succeeded his unfortunate father as Duke of Gandia, and had managed to retain his Neapolitan estates, which included an extensive domain in Terra di Lavoro, with the cities of Suessa, Teano, Carinola, Montefuscolo, Fiume, and others. In 1506, the youthful Gandia relinquished these towns to the King of Spain on payment of a sum of money. To the great Captain Gonsalvo was given the Principality of Suessa. Don Giovanni remained in Spain a highly respected grandee. He married Giovanna d'Aragona, a princess of the deposed royal house of Naples. His second wife was a daughter of the Viscount of Eval, Donna Francesca de Castro y Pinos, whom he married in 1520. The marriages of the Borgias were as a rule exceedingly fruitful. When this grandson of Alexander VI died in 1543, he left no fewer than 15 children. His daughters married among the grandees of Spain, and his sons were numbered among the great nobles of the country, where they enjoyed the highest honors. The eldest, Don Francesco Borgia, born in 1510, became Duke of Gandia and a great lord in Spain, and highly honored at the court of Charles V, who made him vice-regent of Catalonia and commander of San Iago. He accompanied the emperor on his expedition against France and even to Africa. In 1529, he married one of the ladies-in-waiting to the empress, Eleonora de Castro, who bore him 5 sons and 3 daughters. When she died in 1546, the Duke of Gandia yielded to his long-standing desire to enter the Society of Jesus and to relinquish his brilliant position forever. It seemed as if a mysterious force was impelling him thus to expiate the crimes of his house. It is not strange, however, to find a descendant of Alexander VI in the garb of a Jesuit, for the diabolic force of will which had characterized that Borgia lived again in the person of his countryman Loyola in another form and directed to another end. The maxims of Machiavelli's prince thus became part of the political program of the Jesuits. In 1550, the Duke of Gandia went to Rome to cast himself at the feet of the Pope and to become a member of the order. Paul III, brother of Giulia Farnese, had just died, and Del Monte, as Julius III, had ascended the papal throne. Ercole II, cousin of Don Francesco, still occupied the ducal throne of Ferrara. He remembered the relationship and invited the traveler to stop at his city on his way to Rome. Francesco spent 3 days at the court of Lucretia's son, where he was received by René. Whether Loyola's brilliant pupil had any knowledge of the religious attitude of Calvin's friend is not known. The presence of this man in Savonarola's native city and at Lucretia's former residence is, on account of the contrast, remarkable. Francesco left for Rome almost immediately and then returned to Spain. On the death of Lainez in 1565, he became general, the third in order, of the Society of Jesus. He still held this position at the time of his death, which occurred in Rome in the year 1572. The Church pronounced him holy, and thus a descendant of Alexander VI became a saint. The descendants of this Borgia married into the greatest families of Spain. His eldest son, Don Carlos, Duke of Gandia, married Donna Maddalena, daughter of the Count of Oliva of the House of Centel, and thus the family to which Lucretia's first suitor belonged, after the lapse of 50 years, became connected with the Borgias. The Gandia branch survived until the 18th century, when there were 2 cardinals of the name of Borgia who were members of it. Ercole II did not discover the heretical tendencies of his wife Renée until 1554, when he placed her in a convent. The noble princess remained true to the Reformation. As the Inquisition stamped out the reform movement in Ferrara while her son was reigning duke, she returned to France, where she lived with the Huguenots in her castle of Montargis, dying in 1575. It is worthy of note that the Duke of Guise was her son-in-law. Renée had borne her husband several children, the hereditary Prince Alfonso Luigi, who subsequently became a cardinal, Donna Anna, who married the Duke of Guise, Donna Lucretia, who became Duchess of Urbino, and Donna Leonora, who remained single. Her son Alfonso II succeeded to the throne of Ferrara in 1559. This was the duke whom Tasso made immortal. Just as Ariosto, during the reign of the first Alfonso and Lucretia, had celebrated the house of Este in a monumental poem, so Torquato Tasso now continued to do so at the home of his descendant, Alfonso II. By a curious coincidence, the 2 greatest epic poets of Italy were in the service of the same family. Tasso's fate is one of the darkest memories of the house of Este, and it is also the last of any special importance in the history of the court of Ferrara. His poem may be regarded as the death song of this famous family, for the legitimate line of the house of Este died out October 27, 1597, in Alfonso II, Lucretia Borgia's grandson. Don Caesar, a grandson of Alfonso I, and son of that Alfonso whom Laura Diante had borne him, and of Donna Giulia Rovere of Urbino, ascended the ducal throne of Ferrara on the death of Alfonso II as his heir. The Pope, however, would not recognize him. In vain he endeavored to prove that his grandfather, shortly before his death, had legally married Laura Diante, and that consequently he was the legitimate heir to the throne. It availed nothing for the contestants to appear before the tribunal of Emperor and Pope and endeavor to make Don Caesar's pretensions good, nor does it now avail for the Ferrarese, who, following Muratori, still seek to substantiate these claims. Don Caesar was forced to yield to Clement VIII, January 13, 1598, the grandson of Alfonso I, renouncing the Duchy of Ferrara. Together with his wife, Virginia Medici, and his children, he left the old palace of his ancestors and betook himself to Modena, the title of Duke of that city and the estates of Reggio and Carpi having been conferred upon him. Don Caesar continued the branch line of the Este. At the end of the 18th century, it passed into the Austrian Este house, in the person of Archduke Ferdinand, and in the 19th century this line also became extinct. No longer do the popes control Ferrara. Where the castle of Tedaldo stood when Lucretia made her entry into the city in 1502, where Clement VIII later erected the great castle which was raised in 1859, there is now a wide field, in the middle of which, lost and forgotten, is a melancholy statue of Paul V, and all about is a waste. There is still standing before the castle of Giovanni Sforza in Pesaro a column from which the statue has been overturned, and on the base is the inscription, quote, "Statue of Urban VII." That is all that is left of it. End of chapter 12. End of Lucretia Borgia by Ferdinand Gregorovius. Translated by John Leslie Garner.